Well, welcome everyone to the second, I'm surprised, we actually have a second Faroes Shetland Research Symposium, part of the Islands Matter webinar series. I'm Andrew Jennings, and the Associate Professor of Island Studies with the Institute for Northern Studies, UHI, based at UHI Shetland. Now, this event has been organised by a small group of colleagues in the Faroe Islands and Shetland. Our small group includes Faroes Guinea, Erika Hayfield from the Faroes Faroe, and myself, Simon Clark and John Goodlad, representing the Institute for Northern Studies and UHI Shetland. Now, the rationale for the symposium is a desire to reconnect researchers working on similar things across the sea, researchers working in the Faroe Islands and researchers working in Shetland, and by studying what each is researching, to learn from each other. We here in Shetland are fascinated by the success of Faroese society. In fact, we can't get enough Faroese stories in our newspapers and media. We're particularly interested in, at the moment, the Faroese undersea tunnels. And we want to try and copy your funding, well, the way that you funded your tunnels so that we could have some. And we also ask ourselves, how can we copy the ability of the Faroese population to grow so much? How do we copy that success? Today, we'll be mainly focusing on contemporary issues and research, things like renewable energy, politics, fisheries, education, and migration. So there's plenty there for the social scientists and those who are keen to know what the future might hold for the islands. The way it's going to happen, it's going to work, is that we're going to start with 10-minute talks from our speakers, or 10 minutes or thereabouts. You know, I don't have one of these signs to hold up, like stop now or stop in 5 minutes. I don't have one of those. And after each talk, there'll be 5 minutes or so for questions associated with that particular paper. So those who are panelists can actually speak, and the others who are attendees, if you'd like to post your questions in the chat, and in fact we might at some point just convert everybody into a panelist, because it looks as if there aren't a huge number of attendees. At the end of the talks, there'll be more opportunity for specific questions and for more general ones. Things like, how do we increase the research collaboration across the islands? And one of the things that I'm interested in is how is research funding actually funded in the Faroe Islands, and is there ways that we could sort of tap into shared blocks of funding? The symposium is not only about showcasing some of the excellent research that's being undertaken in the islands. It's also about looking forward to new fields of research and how we might develop joint research projects in future. So just like the previous event, it's an awareness raising session. We're interested to know what's happening in the Faroe Islands, and I'm sure the vice versa. It would be great if we could come up with some recommendations about how we take things forward for our mutual benefit and bring the islands closer together. So we'll spend the final part of the session discussing questions like these and others that will have come up as we've listened to people's talks. If each speaker could begin by telling us briefly who they are and their research interests, and then getting into the talk, that would be great. Now I'm going to follow the list of names that are on the Eventbrite page. So it would be wonderful to hear from Ragnheiður about islanding the green energy transition. Ragnheiður, hello.
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, now I can't hear you, but that's probably okay. Yes, so well, I am Ragnheiður Boðadóttir, and I work at the University of the Faroe Islands. My background is in human ecology. My PhD is in human ecology, and I'm now associate professor of social science at the University of the Faroe Islands. So, and my research, I usually it's quite broad. So it's the study of the relations between nature and society and humans. So it's quite broad, but I usually say that I'm in sustainability science. And so today I would talk about the green energy transition from a Faroese perspective. And should I? So I'm not used to this platform, but should I just continue with the presentation and the slides and?
Absolutely. You'll see down at the bottom there's a number of different buttons, and share content is one of those. So if you click on that, that should bring up some options for you.
Yes, I will see. Can you see my screen?
Not quite yet, but it might. Sometimes it takes a short moment for it to come across.
Okay, I see it now, but let's. Okay, yeah, I can see it's working on it.
Sometimes it takes just a little while for these things to come through. Well, I like the map on your wall. That's an excellent one, the upside down map.
Yes. I get a pop-up. Okay. Can you see it now?
It's coming through. Yeah.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay.
Yes.
It wouldn't allow previously. Yes. Okay. So I'll just dive into it and hope that I'll be able to remain within these 10 minutes, more or less. Yes. So the topic or the theme, islanding the green energy transition. So just very briefly, some of the things that I've been working on in relation to the green energy transition in the Faroe Islands. The official term for the green energy transition in the Faroe Islands, it's orkuskifte, and it looks much like this. It's renewable energy. At the same time, it's the scope of the green energy transition. It's mostly relating to electrifying heating and transport on land. So this is from the official website of Orkuskifte in Faroese and translated below. It says something like, in the first round, Orkuskifte, the green energy transition, is mainly about heating and transport on land, but other issues arising along the way on the green course will be addressed and managed when the time is right. So one of my points is that I think the time is quite overdue. But of course, the green energy transition, it's part of the general sustainability transformation that we're hoping to happen, and that we among other places run into with the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's particularly related to Goals 7, 13, and 12. These issues, perhaps, and this is also the Faroese Orkuskifte or green energy transition. It also has goals towards the year 2030, when these Sustainable Development Goals are supposed to when we're supposed to reach them. So one thing is goals, and another thing is reality. So we have some sustainability indicators from the Faroes, and if we look at them in relation to these aforementioned goals, we can look, for instance, at our CO2 emissions and our waste production, and also our consumption, our domestic material consumption, and all of these figures are per capita. And as we can see, the sustainability indicators for the Faroes are they're not very impressive from a sustainability perspective. We're about 3 to 4 times as polluting in most ways than the EU, for instance, or globally. And so therefore, from an island perspective, I thought I could use this concept of islanding that it's Baldacchino and Clark, for instance, refer to this in their editorial Islanding Cultural Geographies from 2013. It's from a poem by Teresia Teiva, and it's Shall We Make Island a Verb? And it's also Pugh and Chandler, for instance, in their book on Anthropocene islands, just came out more recently. They also use these words to introduce their book. Shall we make island a verb? So thinking the Faroese green energy transition from this perspective. If we look at a part of this poem, To Island, it's very much of this using the island metaphor to describe Earth Island, and with a focus on the finite resources and limited space that an island represents. So this is an often used metaphor, but the idea of using it as a word, as something you do, something that you island, I think this is an interesting thing to think with as well. And if we think energy production in such a relational, temporal and spatial perspective, we can also turn the metaphor on its head. And instead of using the island metaphor to understand what is going on in the world, we can use the global metaphor to understand what's going on in the Faroes. So what if we were to Faroe Island, for instance, global energy production? So this figure is from the official electricity company, in the Faroes, owned by the municipalities. And it's the projected energy production, and this is from 2017, I think. So it's the time period from when the sustainability goals sort of begin, and until 2030, when they're supposed to have been reached. And so this is like the imaginary of the Faroese energy production. And if we look at these arrows, this is then what actually happened now that we are in these are the figures from 2022. As we see, or the black part of the figure, that's of course the fossil fuel energy production. And it was imagined that it would go down, and in reality, of course, it went up. But also the total energy production went up. And of course, this is seen as success, and there's no discussion about how far this is a success. So if we, for instance, imagine that the whole world was able to increase their green energy production as rapidly as in the Faroe Islands, their total energy production or their green energy production, it doesn't matter. If we imagine that energy production globally, green, grows or increases at this rate, within 400 years, for instance, the Earth would be boiling. So this is, if we are thinking about Faroe Islanding energy production, this is what it would look like. So of course this isn't what we hope will happen, but this is actually what we are sort of planning for. So, and I think that this the metaphor is interesting in that sense, and it should give us something to think about. So we can also look, for instance, at these energy transitions through the analytical lens of island social metabolism. That is to look at, and this is a quote from an article, to look at renewable energy transitions as not simply a matter of plugging new sources of energy into an existing energy assemblage, but rather of re-engineering the energy metabolism around new material substances that interact with existing social, political, economic, and infrastructural networks, and doing so in particular geographic locales. And of course, I hope to work more on this, and other people are beginning to work on this as well. Because I really think that we need to think more about how Faroe Islanding might become a more sustainable activity. But as it is now, we see very little initiative, both in the political and the industrial sectors, to reduce social metabolism, because of course energy production is related to all kinds of other activities that are, according to our indicators, not very sustainable. But there's little initiative to address these issues of both climate change and biodiversity loss that the energy production and consumption is driving. And we also see very little discussion about how much energy and energy for what. So I think it's also interesting to think about islanding forces as sustainability forces and how they might arise. And I think perhaps one of the most likely ways that they will arise is from the land use conflicts that energy production will produce, I think, as energy production is becoming more land-based and therefore appropriating land locally, not only in other places. So yes, that was just very briefly and overarching. Let me see if I can stop sharing my screen here. Yeah, did I stop sharing now?
You have,
Yeah.
you have down here. Thank you very much. Lots of things to think about there, which are absolutely relevant to what's happening here in Shetland as well, which I'm sure will generate some discussion after when we get to this the wider discussion part of the session. I don't think anyone has posted anything in the chat at the moment, but I noted, I did a quick Google search, and the carbon footprint of Shetland is 10.2 tons per capita. And we wondered whether there is something about island communities that actually means that they're likely to be of higher carbon footprints than the average on the mainland. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah. I think definitely, especially if we think that we need transport further. I mean, long distance transport and all of these things. But still, there are also opportunities, I guess, that we're not really seeing, I guess, and also at the same time. We're extremely vulnerable because most of that energy comes from the outside. So it's if we're cut off, then because at least in the Faroe Islands, most of our key social functions, they're dependent on energy coming from the outside. So So also in that sense, islanding energy production could also mean to increase self-sufficiency. And I think also the political situation has highlighted, well, recent developments with war and everything in Europe. It has highlighted this aspect of the green energy transition as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. I have other questions, but I'll leave them until later on. But I see Simon's got his hand up.
Yeah, a couple of things in relation to islands and whether they are inevitably more less green, more carbon heavy in terms of their consumption. I believe the sea transport sector is now about 10% of carbon output in the world, and slightly depressingly, if you catch the ferry from Shetland to the mainland to get as an alternative to flying, you're actually producing more carbon than if you took a plane. So I think this will be a big challenge as other aspects of the economy decarbonize. Sea transport will become more and more significant as a proportion of the remaining carbon, and I think obviously land transport is rapidly decarbonizing. We haven't even really begun with air or sea transport.
Thank you. I see Ragnheiður, you're. I keep trying to pronounce it Icelandic. I must miss out the Ragnheiður.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I saw you were nodding your head.
Yeah, and the Faroes emissions are well, I think approximately at least half of the Faroes emissions are from the fisheries. So it's sea transport is it's an issue that because you don't have a technical solution, you just avoid the problem. So the Faroes green energy transition is not about that at all, because you don't have a technical solution, and you're not willing to go into a social or political discussion about that.
Thank you. Viveka, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was wondering in connection with the islanding concept and so on, and islands having a higher footprint. For one, as someone who worries a lot about statistics, doesn't it first of all depend on what we put in the equation of what constitutes a footprint? And secondly, the ones who calculate the footprint, I would like to see a study to see what is their environment. I would wager that that's mostly land-based and not really island-based. So if, when we calculate footprints, we also think about island sustainability and essentially being as self-sufficient as possible, would that not reduce the footprint a lot? But that would mean that if we produce energy on an island, it stays on the island for the consumption of the islanders and doesn't get transported away, during which transport a lot is lost, which adds to the footprint, and so on. So I was wondering if the concept of islanding would also mean taking the whole carbon footprint equation and reevaluating that from an islander's perspective, recalculate what is a footprint from an islander's perspective.
Yeah, and I don't mean to say that island footprints are necessarily higher than mainland footprints, because I don't know, and then there are plenty of island societies that don't have high carbon footprints, so, and that have a relatively high level of welfare and well-being. So I don't think there is necessarily a connection there, and I don't think it's the islandness of the Faroe Islands that defines the high carbon footprint, not only, at least. But I think, and of course you can make these calculations however you want to, but carbon is carbon. and at least from the Faroese perspective, or in the Faroese case, the per capita footprint, carbon footprint, and all other kinds of footprints, it's extremely high, and there is no discussion about reducing it. So, and I think that that's problematic, and it becomes quite obvious when you're an island society. It's easier to see.
Thank you very much. Well, we've got time for one more question just now, and Rosie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Thank you. I was really interested in the use of the concept of islanding. I guess what I was thinking about was how islands raise awareness around boundedness and connectivity. And I was thinking about how in Orkney, where I am, we have a number of small islands who have their own community wind turbines and are sort of generating electricity on a kind of community basis and exporting it to the grid, but also using it internally. And I don't know how common this is in Shetland or in the Faroe Islands, how far like individual island communities are working together to create new green technologies, and then thinking about the use of that energy within an island as well. So I don't know if you had any reflections on that.
Yeah, I don't know exactly. So Orkney is quite famous for its energy system, but I don't know actually exactly how it's organized. In the Faroes, the electricity production it's an organization owned by the municipalities, so it's quite collective. But we have a lot of discussions now about how to best organize this politically. But as it is now, it's quite centralized, and there is a national strategy, and but there are so many interesting aspects to discuss also in relation to what you're raising. We're not really having those discussions very much.
Well, lots to think about. As I say, there's I have more questions for afterwards about sustainable energy in the Faroe Islands, but I will keep those under my hat. And you mentioned around here the fishing industry, so we'll move on to our next speaker, John Goodlett, who is a fisheries policy expert and also a figure of political interest, shall we say. So John's going to talk about home rule and contemporary fisheries policy in Shetland. Hello, John.
Hi, Andrew. Thanks very much. Yes, Andrew says I've worked in the seafood industry mostly in Shetland for most of my life. I have a very long interest in the Faroe Islands. I've been many times. I must have visited 12 or 15 times, so I know the Faroe Islands very well, and find the Faroe Islands so inspirational in so many ways to Shetland, and that's why I think this research symposium is so good, that we can get these links between University of Islands and Faroe. I want to talk about home rule and contemporary fisheries policy. Island autonomy, insofar as Shetland is concerned, is an aspiration. Island autonomy, as far as Faroe is concerned, is a reality. The political debate in Faroe is how does the Faroes move beyond autonomy towards independence, whereas in Shetland we're still trying to grapple with a little bit of autonomy from either Scotland or the UK. So island autonomy is discussed frequently, and I'm delighted to say is discussed more and more within Shetland, but it's often discussed in rather academic forums, and that's all very well and good, but it's really important to remind ourselves, I think, of how island autonomy can be a very practical benefit for ordinary people. And I want to look at the seafood industry to illustrate that point. The seafood industry is, of course, enormously important to the Faroe Islands. It's also very important to Shetland. One jaw-dropping statistic, which I love to use in a UK context, is to say that there is more fish by weight, either farmed fish or wild-caught fish, more fish by weight landed in Shetland every year than is landed in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland combined. So the fishing industry and the aquaculture industry is very, very important to Shetland. Fishing has always been central to Shetland economy, its society and its culture. I want to look quickly at two fisheries policy instruments. One that was a complete and utter ill thought out disaster, almost imposed by central government in Scotland, and the other one that was a local initiative here in Shetland, which has worked extremely well. So first of all, I want to look at the success story. Shetland has for a long time argued that it should have more say over its fisheries management. And to a Faroese audience, this will seem absolute common sense, and the fact that you're still struggling even to get the smallest amount of local control over fisheries is very, very is in a very stark contrast to the Faroes. The Shetland community was able to persuade the Scottish fisheries officials that we should have more control in Shetland over our inshore fisheries, the shellfish fisheries. And one of the first acts of the new Scottish Parliament, when it was established in 1999, was to grant the ability for the Shetland community to manage its own shellfish fisheries within 6 miles of the Shetland coast. It's quite unique. This happens nowhere else in the UK. It happens nowhere else in Scotland. And so what was this local management system? It was something called the Shetland Shellfish Management Organisation was established, and that represents the fishing industry of Shetland and a number of community interests. It does not represent the local government in Shetland. So it's not a government initiative. It's very much from the fishing community itself. And that body, the Shetland Shellfish Management Organisation, has been granted by the Scottish government the ability to regulate and manage fishing for all shellfish stocks within 6 miles of Shetland. So how does it do that? It primarily does that by limiting the number of vessels that can participate in the fishery. You need a permit to fish around Shetland, and that permit limit is decided locally, very much on the basis of the first-class research provided by Shetland UHI, and Siobhan will be talking later about the work on Shetland fisheries research. And in addition to the permit scheme, there are limits on gear size, on vessel, on gear numbers of creels, on numbers of scallop dredges that can be used. There are closed seasons and there are closed areas. So it's a whole raft of detailed regulation. I think for the purposes of today's discussion, I think the message I want to get through is it has been an enormous success. Shellfish stocks are managed sustainably. They're in very, very good state around Shetland, and the industry is highly profitable. External validation of how sustainable this management system is has recently been provided by the Marine Stewardship Council, MSC, which is the global organisation for certifying sustainability in fisheries. And the brown crab, the velvet crab, and the scallop fisheries around Shetland are able to be sold with MSC certificates. These are the only crab and scallop fisheries in the UK that have an MSC certificate. So a huge success. It took a long time to develop. It was a local initiative. It developed from the bottom up, was applied, it was extensively discussed. It's sort of community-based autonomy at its very best. Now, I want to contrast that with what might have been a complete and utter disaster. 2 years ago, the Scottish National Party, which is the largest party in the Scottish government, in the Scottish Parliament, and the Green Party entered into a coalition. And the Bute House Agreement, as part of that, was a proposal to designate 10% of Scottish seas as highly marine protected areas. Within these HMPAs, it was proposed that there would not only be no fishing and no fish farming and no offshore renewables, but also no leisure activities, no sailing, no rowing, no leisure activities, no swimming, no surfing. And based on what seemed to be absolutely no scientific basis whatsoever, it was simply a Green Party policy that was a red line for the coalition. There was a predictable uproar in Scotland's coastal and island communities, including Shetland. And I don't know in the Faroe Islands if you know much about Scottish folk music, but a fisherman from a small Scottish island of Tiree and a member of the Scottish folk band called Skippinish, who are quite well known nationally and international, he wrote a song, this guy called Angus MacPhail wrote a song called The Clearances Again, which told the story that if these HMPAs were introduced in Scotland, the impact on rural and island communities would be very similar to the clearances of the 19th century. And for the Faroese audience, this was a situation where there was effectively a degree of ethnic cleansing of the lands of the West Highlands, where many crofters, small landowners, were cleared off the land by the landowners to make way for sheep. Many emigrated to the Americas. And the clearances is a very dark period of Scottish history, which even yet evokes incredible emotion. So a song about another round of clearances where people would be forced over off the land, this time fishermen and fish farmers forced away from the land because of the HMPA designation. The clearances again reached number 5 in the UK download charts, and it's going to be premiered again at the Celtic Connections Music Festival in Glasgow in January. While all of this was going on, I attended the Scottish Government meeting about HMPAs, which was held in Lerwick. And there was standing room only. And I've worked in the seafood industry all my life in Shetland. I'm a Shetlander. Shetlanders are pretty laid back people. They are not given to histrionics. They're not given to emotion. Very similar to Faroese people in many ways. But I've never seen so many Shetlanders so angry about the failure of central government and how the Scottish government was failing island communities, including Shetland. The public outcry within Scotland led to a split within the SNP when Fergus Ewing, member of the Scottish Parliament, who had previously been the Scottish Fisheries Minister, described these HMPA proposals as something which had been dreamt up by wine bar revolutionaries in Edinburgh who had never got their hands dirty by doing a day's work in their lives. And he then proceeded to tear up the consultation document in the Scottish Parliament. I'm pleased to say that the campaign, which was undertaken throughout rural and island Scotland, including Shetland, led to these proposals being withdrawn. So 2 conclusions from that look at a local bottom-up fisheries management and then top-down and post-fisheries management. 2 conclusions. First of all, top-down governance imposed by central government, whether that's in Scotland or the UK, rarely works for islands. And that's because the centre, whether it's Scotland or the UK, rarely understands the periphery. And the second conclusion is that in contrast to that method of governance, autonomy is an efficient and effective method of governance. It should be the normal state of affairs for islands in all aspects of our society, not just in fishing. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, 2 very contrasting situations there. Do you have any idea or any thoughts about how the shellfish provision might develop, or whether there's other things in the offing since it's being a success? Are there other elements, small elements of devolution that might sort of appear?
Yeah, that's a very good question, Andrew. And I think there are 2 points there. I think many other parts of Scotland are looking at the Shetland Regulating Order example as a template for inshore fisheries management in those areas. So that's been ongoing for some time, but you know, no one's managed to quite get anything in place, but it's being discussed. And then, of course, the obvious, or at least to me, the obvious situation is how far can this system of local fisheries management, which only applies to shellfish and only applies to 6 miles of the Shetland coast, how can that be extended around Shetland to include other fish species? And that's, you know, something which I would hope will become a much more active debate and discussion in the future. But of course, all of that types of discussions on extending and this incredibly successful method of fisheries management was sort of thrown to the winds with the HMP proposal. Instead of wondering how these good ideas could be extended to other areas and extended beyond 6 miles, you know, instead of that being done, suddenly 10% of Scottish waters, including areas around Shetland, were going to be closed for everything. So it's really sort of held up that very good discussion which should be taking place.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. And I see, Erica, you've got your hand up. Oh, you're still on mute. Oh, no, you're not. So you're not muted, but we can't hear you.
Underneath the mute button, you'll see a wee drop-down arrow. And from there, you'll be able to select another microphone to see how that works. No, we're still not hearing you, no.
You hear me now?
Yes, we
We can hear you, yes.
That's great, thank you. Thank you for a very interesting talk, John, and sorry about that. I was very intrigued, and this your talk sort of sparked thoughts sort of parallel to the Faroe Islands about sustainability and really how quotas are allocated and who gets to fish, because there's a lot of political tension in the Faroes about that, and sometimes sustainability and fisheries management is a clash of discourses from, you know, practitioners who are fishing and marine biologists. So I wondered, how do Shetland authorities manage the allocation of who gets to fish and how much? And so what's the process involved in that?
That's a really good question, and I'm very much aware of how political the allocation of fish quotas is in the Faroe Islands. And I was up in August and was up at the Seamen's Week in Klaksvik and had really interesting discussions with some fishing vessel owners who wanted to keep the system as it was, and others who wanted to see the system being loosened up. In many ways, it's very similar in Shetland, where fish quota has become an asset, which is bought and sold and leased, and it's becoming concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. And that's very much the Scottish system of fisheries management, which is applied across the whole of Scotland, including Shetland. Shetland, I'm pleased to say, has a large proportion of the Scottish quota is held by Shetlanders. And Shetland is perhaps, there are two things happening in Shetland which are perhaps might be of interest to the Faroese. The regulation of fish quotas within Scotland is done through fishermen's organisations called producer organisations. And although the quotas, the individual quotas, are held by individual vessel owners and fishermen, they're kind of coordinated by these producer organisations. Shetland has its own fish producers organisation, and in the, about 20 years ago, when fish quotas first began to be bought and sold, the Shetland Fish Producers Organisation went into the market and acquired a large proportion of fish quota. So about 30% of the fish quota, which is fished by Shetlanders, is actually owned by the community, if you like, by the or at least by the community of fishermen. It's not owned by any one individual fish company, but it's fished by all of them, but the ownership resides with the Shetland Fish Producers Organisation. And that's kind of unique in Scotland. Other Scottish producer organisations have done a little bit of that, a little bit has been done in Orkney, but largely hasn't been to the same scale as in Shetland. And then the second initiative, which is really interesting, is that vessels of less than 10 metres, and I know this applies in Iceland, I'm not sure about Faroe, vessels of less than 10 metres aren't able to participate in the individually held quota system, and they fish out of a national pool. And the Scottish Government, for anyone who thinks I was knocking them over the HMPAs, which I was, the Scottish Government, to their credit, have created a large pool of fish for the under 10 metre vessels, especially cod and particularly mackerel. And these vessels fish with hand lines. And the result of that has been, there's now been an absolute unbelievable expansion in the number of under 10 metre vessels in Shetland fishing for mackerel and cod. If you go around any of the Shetland marinas, you will see now that the small fishing boats outnumber the pleasure crafts in most of the marinas. And many young people have been able to get into the fishing industry without being quota owners by fishing this under 10 metre sector. So there's a couple of really interesting developments in Shetland, the under 10 metre sector, which has become big in Shetland, and the community held fish quota pool, which might be of interest to the Faroese. But it's not this debate between who owns the quota and who doesn't. It's very live in Iceland. It's decided the result of elections in Iceland. It's very live in New Zealand and in all countries that have gone down the quota route. The whole transition between what was owned by everybody, a common resource, and is now owned by individuals, has become, and quite rightly so, a subject of great discussion and a big political issue.
Thank you very much, John. And we'll stay with fisheries. If you've got other questions that you want to ask John and bring up, we'll do that later on. But we'll move now to Siobhan from UHI Shetland Scalava campus, who's going to talk about fisheries research. Solo, Siobhan.
Hi, I'll just try and share my presentation. Screen. Hopefully that will be coming up.
It is indeed.
Yep. Okay, right, see if I can get this on a presentation thing. Is that on the presentation view yet, or is it still sitting?
It's still sitting as
Still sitting.
it was.
Okay, we'll try this. There we go.
That's it.
Okay, now I'll have to see if I can get that off of my second screen because I'm not seeing you at all. There, is you better. Is it working now for everybody? I cannot see what you're seeing.
Yes, looks good.
Okay, so quick introduction. I'm Siobhan Angus. I'm the Joint Head for Marine Sciences Department at Shetland UHI. My background is in fishery science. I've been working here in various roles for more than 25 years now on a range of different fisheries and fish gear, fisheries management projects, and at the moment heading up our department. This is really just a very broad scale overview of some of the activities that we do in relation to fisheries research. There is not time to do justice to any of it really, but it'll give you a broad overview of some of the activities that we undertake. Our department is split into three main teams. So we have our fisheries one, an aquaculture one, and the marine spatial planning one. Although they're separate, there is links across all three, and a lot of our projects pull on resources for each of that teams. Within the fisheries team, we have 4 work streams. The demersal, which is mainly around whitefish, our pelagic work stream, shellfish work stream that John has already alluded to, and we have a small work stream, but quite important one, around fisheries policy and advice. So I'll just go through each of our work streams in turn, just to give you a flavour of what we do. In terms of our demersal work stream, we undertake a range of activities, including surveys, fishing gear trials, data collection for that goes in towards the international stock assessments. We work closely with the Marine Directorate on those type of programmes. We also undertake commercial data analysis and consultancy work, as well as a range of other projects. We are lucky enough to have our own fishing vessel, which is shown in the picture there, and enables us to do local work around Shetland in relation to some of these projects. So just touching on our inshore fish survey, this has been undertaken around Shetland for, oops, why is that going? Around 12 years now. We sample, you can see on the maps there, we're sampling locations. We go around, this is a small gear based survey aimed at sampling juvenile fish in order to get an indication of what the recruitment into the stocks is going to be in the near future. It's on a small scale, far smaller scale, far better geographically defined than the international surveys. It's they're for a different purpose, but it is also enabled a lot of other projects to tag onto it and use information out of it around nursery areas, potential areas that we should be looking at protecting for the sake of being nursery areas and around juvenile fish. We have a lot of issues currently around spatial squeeze. Marine renewables, cables, all sorts of things. Everybody is wanting a piece of action on the seabed, and it is impacting both fish biology potentially and where some of the fishing activities can occur. So in order to get, we need to get proper information on what's going on a very fine spatial scale around Shetland, because a lot of these areas are incredibly important as nursery areas that feed into the recruitment into the wider fishery. So we've been able to work with industry support for this, and this has had impacts on some of the assessments that's taken place. We are now in a process looking how we can get this data to feed in on a more regular basis into some of the international assessments. But tagged onto this project, we've had information on projects around tidal stream research, wind farm research, cetacean use of the environment, also bird-related use of some of the environments, and feed and diet studies. So it's enabled a lot of other research to be hung around this project. More directly relevant to the whitefish fleet, we've just sort of recently embarked on a new project. This is a DEFRA funded project on ling. We did some work on ling between 10 and 15 years ago. It's an important species for the whitefish fleet, but ling tend to aggregate and can be incredibly dense numbers and high abundance in very localized areas, and there's a bit of a mismatch between the quota allocations and the fish availability on the ground, which is causing a lot of problems for the local fleet. This is quite a large project. We have 5 different work packages in it. The exciting one that the industry is participating in at the moment is using a BAT map. It's an electronic app that they can record their catches on a very fine spatial scale, far finer spatial scale than is being recorded on the official landing sheets, and so we can derive some really good biological information on that. So that's just a quick flavour of that project. Again, there's a fisheries industry science partnership project, as is most of our research projects. We work very closely with industry, and most of it is in the area of applied research rather than research for research's sake. We're also doing a project at the moment on elasmobranchs. This is becoming increasingly topical. There's not a lot known around the large barn door skate, or flapper skate as they're now known as. We're doing some tagging work on that. There's been some work around the west coast of Scotland, and this will be an add-on around this. We're developing another project that will follow on for this one. Again, it will link into other areas. We're marine spatial planning side of things, we're predictive habitat mapping, and also potentially identifying areas where they should be, based on scientific knowledge, where they should be protected. Interestingly, some of the work that's been undertaken on the west coast, they're using the spot pattern that you can see on one of the photos there. Each of the fish have an individual, almost like a fingerprint. The spot pattern is unique. So by deploying underwater cameras, as is done with some of the killer whale type records, we can start looking at building up a library of known skate without actually having to handle them. But the tagging information is also important for getting growth data as well. On our pelagic fleet, we have a large, we have a number of pelagic vessels. The large fishing vessels are located.
Your sound has just gone, Siobhan.
Are you hearing me now?
We can hear you now. That's great.
I seem to be frozen there. I got that blue circle of doom. But I'm back again. So yeah, we're pelagic fleet project workstream. We have been working initiative. The Pelagic Association, the Scottish Association, and also we Marine Directorate. This started off as a industry initiative and then was funded through a European programme. It is now at the stage that we are have an ongoing programme of work. We have a pelagic scientist based full-time here, and that's funded by the Scottish industry. We also have a new pelagic PhD just started. What this work programme has enabled is far better data to be collected. We've completely changed in Scotland the way that data around the pelagic fishery is collected and goes in towards the international stock assessments. It used to be done at the processors. Now the fishers themselves are collecting the data under a self-sampling scheme. We undertake co-sampling, where they provide WSWI samples that we collect biological data from. And there's a number of research projects developed around this and ongoing around this. So it's a very, very successful work stream that we see expanding in the future. The other thing is that the participation by industry is all voluntary. So it is completely based on industry buy-in and good communication with industry. We do a lot of work around maintaining relationships and feedback loops in terms of information back to the industry. So yeah, there's been scientific impact in terms of research publications, but also in terms of management. And then the shellfish that Jonas already touched on, we at Shetland UHI undertook the research and stock assessment to enable the Shellfish Management Organisation to implement their fisheries management plans. We do work closely with them, and some of the research, the projects is commissioned by them, but the ongoing body of work that needs to be done is not an insignificant amount of work, and it results that we have sort of one of the best defined stock assessments for shellfish on this sort of small scale area. We have probably the best data set in Europe for some of that work that we do. So yeah, this is kind of recapping some of what John has already said. The SSMO covers regulation within 6 nautical miles. We collect data on a range of the shellfish species, both routine data collection and targeted research projects, undertake stock assessments and provide advice to the SSMO. We're not directly involved in the management decisions. We just provide the advice to them, so that there has to be scientific independence for that process. But yeah, we have the stock assessments. We also, along with our marine spatial planning team, undertake work around spatial management. Industry themselves have come forward and suggested a number of areas that should be protected for various habitats, such as marl beds and horse mussels and whatnot. And so they themselves, as an industry, have already led to the protection of some areas of seabed. And that again has had positive impacts when they have put forward for their MSC accreditation. We're fisheries policy and advice. We undertake a range of work along with or for the local fishing industry. A lot of that is around interpreting scientific data and making it into a more manageable and usable output that they can then use for their own purposes, and that sort of thing. So, and also producing fishery statistics for them, work around the maritime economy, but the main body of that work is around interpreting scientific information and producing advice and to meet their needs. And I think that's the end of my slides. Is that stopped sharing now?
It has, Siobhan. Thank you very much. Lots of really interesting research being undertaken there, and a vital resource that you provide.
Very much a very quick, brisk skim through a lot of it, and not much detail on it. But if anybody wants to follow up with more specific questions on any of it, I'm quite happy to take them outside this meeting.
Yeah, absolutely, or within, if people
have
some,
yes, if there's
questions.
time.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
I was just wondering, with the HMPAs, did anybody contact you for information or for research?
There was a public consultation that we responded to on behalf of Shetland UHI. Mm-hmm. We were personally and within work in a lot of dialogue with fishermen and different groups contacting, just because you're an island community, folk knows who you are. So there was a lot of phone calls and email traffic and around that. But given the time scale between the consultation coming out and the responses to be back, there's not enough time to do the research that's required. So you're kind of scrabbling around. There is some information around there and some research. Some of it is better quality than others. So you're trying to grapple around to do the literature research pull the literature together, but the research, a lot of it that actually needs to be done before the implementation of a specific protected area, and that takes time and resources. And within the time frame in the proposal for implementation of these closed areas, there wasn't enough. We didn't feel that there was enough time or resource to do a proper scientific analysis of some of the areas that were likely to be proposed for closure. Nor had there probably been enough consideration into the costing that would have been associated with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we did robustly put back replies on the consultation document.
Yes. Faroes.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I was just wondering if you have any research collaboration or networking with the Faroe Islands or the Nordic countries?
Not at present. In the past, I have done some work with monkfish. My PhD was on monkfish, and I had I was involved in a couple of Nordic Council funded projects with the Institute in Faroe and partners also in Norway, but we haven't done any research, any collaborative projects for a number of years now. But always looking to explore opportunities to do more. I think it's the funding and the match funding that's been the downfall on a couple of proposed projects. We had looked at some work around RAS in the fishery and around the aquaculture settings, but it was funding was the downfall in terms of, I think the Nordic countries were had more access to some of the fundings, and we were our requirement for some of the match funding caused a couple of proposals to fall by the wayside. But yeah, we would like to explore opportunities for collaborative research again.
It makes so much sense because fish don't know where the borders are. They just swim.
No, they don't.
Right here. Sorry, Siobhan.
Yeah. I was just wondering. We also heard before that total catch in Shetland is quite high. Do you know roundabouts where it is in total or per capita?
I can't remember off the top of my head, but I can get those figures for you.
Yeah, and that would just be interesting. But then I was also thinking, in the Faroes, we have this, at least this stagnation in the demersal fisheries, and the growth in recent decades has been in the pelagic sector. I got the idea that it's perhaps a bit the same.
Yeah, we have a sort of stable number of pelagic boats, but the fleet has all recently been renewed. Some of the older vessels have actually gone up to Faroe and Iceland. But yeah, our pelagic fleet has essentially renewed itself within the last 5 years. So they are a very, very modern fleet. The whitefish fleet, we've had a lot of positive news stories within the last few years. We have an increase in young entrants into the fishing industry. There is challenges around access to quota, there's no doubt about that. And that's an international allocation to the UK. There's always a lot of discussion around that. And there's been sort of fuel prices and all sorts of challenges over the last few years. But there has been additional vessels come into the Shetland fleet within the last few years, and some young crews taken on boats. So that is a very positive situation. There's challenges, financial challenges around making some of it pay, but on the whole, those boats are all doing well, and it's certainly a lot more positive now than it was for a time a number of years back, after the decommissioning and removal of a chunk of the fleet, and there was a lot of uncertainty within the fleet for a number of years, but it's a lot more positive at the moment. If we could just get, for some of the species, a better match between available quota and what the fishermen are seeing on the ground.
Thank you, Siobhan. John, you looked as if you were nodding your head and were keen to say something.
No, I think Siobhan answered everything just perfectly. I was just agreeing with Siobhan as she spoke, so absolutely fine. Nothing more to add.
Great stuff. Siobhan, you said some of the pelagic fleet had renewed itself, and some of the older vessels had gone to the Faroe Islands. Do you know which ones?
I can't mind off the top of my head. There's certainly some of them. There's certainly one or two that's either gone to Faroe or Iceland, and other ones elsewhere.
I think the old research was bought by JFK up in Klaksvik, and I think there's maybe, as you say, 2 or 3 others, Iceland and Faroe. But yeah, I mean, these are very, as Siobhan says, these aren't old boats. These are very modern, new boats, but they they've been sold up to Faroe and of course renamed with Faroese names.
Yeah, I think there's one or two of the northeast coast boats maybe headed the same way as well. There's been a renewal of pelagic vessels in the northeast of Scotland as well. It's not just limited to Shetland. So the pelagic fleet the Scottish pelagic fleet is a very new, very modern fleet.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any fishing orientated questions at the moment? Oh, yes, there's one from Rosie in the chat, which is connecting to her particular research interests. So, Rosie, I wonder if you just want to ask it.
Yeah, sure. I think maybe it's been touched upon, but both John and Siobhan mentioned an increase in young people entering the fishing industry, and I just wondered why that is. Like, if you have any insight as to why young people are entering the industry.
I think it's maybe not an increase as such over the long time period. It's just that we had a dip for a few years in new entrants. Here at Shetland UHI, we ran a course back in September for potential new entrants to do their mandatory training on, and that was very popular. Some of those folk that were on that course have got berths on boats. So, yeah, I think there's always an interest from folk within the community to join the boats, particularly within the likes of Walsall and some of the specific areas where that boats are still based, and it's family-owned boats, and it's the next generation wanting to come in. There was certainly for a number of years, there's been foreign workers on crewing some of that boats. That situation is becoming more difficult in terms of visa access, so that may be having a impact in terms of some of the skippers having to look for a local crew rather than buying in foreign workers. So there may be an influence on that, but I don't know that anybody has specifically been researching that.
Maybe Siobhan, I could just come in. Simon, I see your hand up, but this is really just to amplify the point that Siobhan has made. Rosie, your question, why is there an uptake? I think fishing is a great career. If anybody wants to avoid the drudgery of sitting in office on a computer and getting out, plus the fact you're making good money, there's a sense of freedom. Who wouldn't want to be a fisher? So I think that's part of it. Plus, it's in the Shetland culture. Every family in Shetland has some fishing connection. So there's a cultural aspect to it. I think one of the main constraints has been and will continue to be, how do you become a fisher if you don't have access to quota? And of course, this great initiative with the under 10 metre vessels, where there really has been literally hundreds of Shetlanders, many of them young, who've got these small vessels. Many of them are fishing part-time at the moment for handlining for mackerel and handlining for cod, but it's an entry into the industry for young fishermen that might otherwise be more difficult. So it's a much more positive time, and not only from an economic but also a social and cultural point of view, it's just fantastic to see the industry getting, as Siobhan has said, more young recruits coming in.
Thank you, John. And as you said, Simon, you had his hand up. You're muted, Simon.
Sorry, it's touching on the same themes. I think this issue of social mobility is a really interesting one. Is it sons following fathers, or is there a bit more fluidity than that? I think the quota system, although necessary to maintain stocks and that sort of thing, is potentially very stifling in terms of social mobility. So I'd be interested to hear your perspectives on that from either John or from Siobhan.
I can come in on that first. I'm sure John will pad out anything that I say. Yeah, there's certainly an element of it of it being a family follow-on, fathers following sons, or nephews following uncles. And I think that probably accounts for a relatively high proportion, but there is also entrants in that don't have any sort of more obvious links into some of these boats. So yeah, in terms of the quota stifling it, yeah, it certainly does. There has to be limits. It becomes what we're seeing within the pelagic sector is that it is such high value now in terms of the actual vessels and the value of the quota that it would be near impossible for anybody to buy a share or set up in it. It also becomes quite difficult in terms of passing that value on to the next generation in terms of inheritance taxes and such like. The whitefish sector is to some degree experiencing some of that, but not to it's not at the same scale as the value of individual vessels and quotas within the pelagic sector. It's an area that needs discussion. There's a lot of work to be done with it. It's quite difficult to see how a best route out of it. It inevitably, I guess, ends up in a decrease in the number of quota holders as things move forward, because that's where the buying capacity is, rather than spreading it thinly across a wider sector. But the undertime, there's vessel sector, that is the good news story in terms of getting people in the door and a foothold.
And Siobhan, just to add one point on that, the pelagic sector, which you've mentioned, 8 Shetland large pelagic vessels, maybe employing 12 men on each. That's about 196 or 100 people employed on these large pelagic vessels in Shetland. The under 10 metre hand liners for mackerel, which only work for a few months, I think there's now 170 of these vessels, mostly with single crew, sometimes with double. So there's almost twice as many Shetlanders employed handlining for mackerel with a tiny quota and getting a premium price for line caught fish than there are on board the large pelagic vessels. So that's I think the bright note for new entrants coming into the industry is in this under 10 metre sector. But how you further develop that, and as Siobhan says, is really up for discussion. But it's an astonishing statistic that there are more hand line mackerel fishers in Shetland than there are on the large pelagic boats.
Thank you very much for that picture of the fishing industry in Shetland today. I see that we have Magni with us now, and Magni was going to talk about blue resource fisheries and aquaculture research in the Faroes. So perhaps now would be the time for Magni to give his talk if he's able to do it. I see, Magni, your camera is not on, so
yeah.
Are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Yeah. Sorry about the camera. My laptop is in for repair, and I got a spare laptop from the repair shop, and I think it's the first time in many years that I had a laptop without a camera. I really tried to make it function. It's the first time I tried to turn on the camera on this laptop because it just went in for repair, and there is simply no camera on this laptop. And I didn't know they even produced laptops without cameras anymore.
That's prehistoric.
Yeah. So sorry about the picture. I'm sorry about that. Yeah. Well, at Sjókovan, I can have a presentation about what we are doing. At Sjókovan, we are focusing on doing socioeconomic research, mainly linked to the fishing industry and to aquaculture. I think the best way to illustrate it is to describe 3 projects we have ongoing. One of them is about seaweed cultivation. So we are helping. The seaweed cultivation is quite a new industry in Europe or in Faroe Islands, and it's a part of an EU project, Horizon 2020 project, and in this project we are going through their economic structure, so we can see how we can reduce the costs of producing seaweed, because this is a new industry. So we are analyzing their cost structure in collaboration with the companies. It's not just in Faroe Islands, it's also in Portugal and France and in different, because it's a European project, but our case is in Faroe Islands, so we are studying their case. So we are analyzing how what the cost structure is analyzing the value chain and doing a report about that, and then we're going in to have a techno-economic analysis where they will come up with different technological solutions, and we will do the economic calculations whether these technological solutions are good or which one is best. So that is for the seaweed cultivation then we do some for regular salmon aquaculture. We just had a presentation for calculations where the salmon aquaculture has a problem with salmon lice. But what is the cost of salmon lice? What is the cost for the Faroese salmon industry of salmon lice? And of course, there's a cost in many different ways. There's a cost simply since the salmon gets sick from salmon lice. It creates wounds and infections and increased mortality. But then also you have to de-lice the salmon farms, and there's a cost of de-licing and there's a cost of increased mortality when you de-lice. So we did all of the calculations associated with the costs of salmon lice and came up with an educated bid for a number of what the cost actually is for the salmon industry, and it's quite large. It's around 300 million euros, which is equivalent to their current profit. So if they could get rid of the salmon lice, and their profit is huge at the moment, so they could double their profit if there wasn't for this salmon lice problem. So the idea is that to put a number on the problem of the salmon lice, but also put a number of where is the problem, and is it the de-licing that is the cost, or is it more increased mortality, or often they have to harvest the salmon at a smaller size than they would like it to be 6 kilos, but they have to harvest at 4 or 5 kilos, which means that you have a decrease in the value of the fish. So there's a lot of different aspects, and we tried to put a number of all of them and came up with a single number of 300 million euros, which is quite substantial. So these are two aquaculture projects. We also do fisheries projects. At the moment, we have just finished one with the climate, how the fishing stocks are affected by climate change and how that will affect the society. We are not doing the climate part, and we are not doing the biological part because we are economists and social scientists. So we are doing the part where we are estimating what the effect would be on society of these projects. So that's about climate change. But in another project, we are monitoring oil usage from each vessel for each fishing trip. We're trying to pinpoint solutions that will reduce oil usage for fisheries. So we get data for every 10 seconds that the fishing vessel is out at sea, and that's because their system is monitoring logging every 10 seconds. So we're monitoring their fishing trips, and we can see how much oil do you use when you are in harbor before you leave for your fishing trip, how much oil do you use when you go out to the fishing field where you want to fish, and how much for each time you cast out your net and try to fish, and how much when you sail back home again. So then we can calculate ways to lower the oil usage, like sailing slower on the way to the fishing trip, or cruising on the way to the fishing field and back again. And we can actually estimate that by using artificial intelligence or machine learning. And that's the way we do it. And the last project I would like to mention is that we are calculating the sources for the Faroese economy. We've been doing that before. I mean, we are updating it now in half a year. We have to deliver an update of that calculations. In Faroe Islands, there are 5 sources. Fisheries is one of them, and aquaculture, and those 2 are the largest. But then you also have tourism, and you have people working abroad. Actually, around 10% of the total workforce in Faroe Islands is working abroad in high-paid jobs and bringing in a lot of income into the Faroe Islands. And then we have an economic grant from Denmark. So those are the 5 sources. But how important are each one of them, and how do they develop over time? So we have data going back to around 1985 and up to today. So we can see how these 5 sources of income, how important they each are for the Faroese economy. So those are the kinds of projects that we are doing. One project that's quite interesting in Shetland and in Orkney is that we also have been participating in calculating the importance and social and economic importance of subsea tunnels in Faroe Islands. And we do a lot of subsea. We like tunnels. Subsea or through mountains, we like them a lot. So we have a lot of tunnels. And what is the economic importance of a tunnel? How much is the saving for people in different regions? What is the effect on demographics? When you open a tunnel instead of a ferry connection, does the population in that island or in that region, does it grow? Or what is the effect on the income level compared to the rest of the Faroe Islands? So we have done that kind of analysis for what's it called? Landsverk. It's the governmental engineering firm. They wanted to have that analysis done. So those are the kinds of analysis we do at the Blue Resource. Mainly fisheries and aquaculture, mainly EU projects. Most of them are EU projects. Some of them are local, like the one with the oil consumption and also the calculations of the subsea tunnels. Those are local projects, but most of the others are EU projects.
Absolutely fascinating research and all extremely relevant to the Shetland situation. Thank you very much. Indeed, Magni, we didn't need your camera after all. But hey, so many interesting things there. I've just completed a book, a joint publication with Laurie Brinklow in University of Prince Edward Island about fixed links and the impact on island communities. Well, it would have been if I'd known that you've been doing this research on the tunnels, I would have tried to get you involved. But it's definitely an interest in mine. And do you have sort of any sort of statistics at hand about the economic impact of establishing a tunnel?
We looked at other reports, but what we could get, what we decided was to use our own Faroe statistics, because we were actually analyzing subsea tunnel number 5. That's so we had experiences from some of them. 2 of them were already opened, and number 3 was just opened when we did the report. Number 4 is being built at the moment. It's not open yet. And we did this analysis for number 5. So we had mainly 2 regions connected by subsea tunnels where we could see the effects. And the effects for those 2 regions were not, they were actually not similar. They were quite distinct. In the first region, that's where the airport is, the income level was lower than in the rest of Faroe Islands, and it was clearly a bottleneck. The ferry connection was clearly a bottleneck. So when you had a fixed link, the income level rose a lot, and the demographics changed a lot in that island. There was a huge influx of people into the island, and it serves as a suburb to the capital city. The other one was for the second largest city in Faroe Islands. It's quite far away from the capital city, but that region, the income level of that region was comparable to the rest of Faroe Islands. It was around average or just above average, and that region had its own economic life. So when they got the subsea tunnel, their income level was not really affected, and the demographics were just a bit affected, not really. So really different setups, and the reasons for the different conclusion was not in whether you get a subsea tunnel or not. It was what's your situation before you get the tunnel. That's really important. If it's a bottleneck, and if you have a lower income level, then you definitely will get a huge advantage from it. In the region of Klaksvík, with the second tunnel, there's not that much of a positive effect, but clearly people are really happy about the tunnel, even though the economic and demographic effects are not that huge. For the 5th tunnel, that was the reason why we analyzed it. It's quite remote. It's a huge tunnel. It's a 20 kilometers tunnel, subsea tunnel. So it's going to be a huge one if we build it. Their income level is clearly lower than the rest of Faroe Islands, but the distance from that island to the capital city is quite long. So the commuting is not going to be as efficient as from the others. So it's not as clear what the effect will be. Probably their income level will rise a bit, and probably they will have an impact on demographics. But it will not serve as a suburb to the capital city. So it has to have its own economic drivers.
Yeah, thank you very much. Each island, each tunnel is different. That's very interesting indeed. And there's 3 hands up. I looked away, so I don't know what who came first, but I've got Siobhan at the top of the screen. So Siobhan.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Yeah, fascinating presentation, Magni. A lot of stuff in there. I was just interested in the seaweed project. We did a seaweed project here on our own aquaculture site a few years ago, and we could grow seaweed no problem. The challenge was then getting the bulk of seaweed either shipped or made into dried and made into a form that was cost effective to ship for use. We were looking at using it for biofuels in the aviation industry for that project. I was wondering if similar challenges are happening in Faroe around the use of seaweed, because it is a heavy, bulky material when it's first produced.
Yeah, there are two seaweed producers in Faroe Islands. One is a small one, it's a kind of a niche production with specialized in different kinds of seaweed. The other one is going for the big scale, large scale operation. Currently, they are harvesting around 300 to 400 ton a year, and they are going up to around 2,000 ton within. Yeah, I'm saying 2,000 because I am limiting their ambitions a bit. They're not aiming for 2,000 ton. They are aiming for around 5,000 ton within 3 to 4 years or something like that. I don't think they're going to make that. So that's why I say 2,000. I think that's actually realistic. Even though they only harvest 300 to 400 at the moment, their production capacity in the ocean, in the sea at the moment, is far larger than 300 to 400. It's because they are growing, so it takes a while before they really can harvest the big quantities. So our analysis is for the larger one, for the larger company. In that company, they are stabilizing the material. They have tried different methods. You're mentioning drying it. Drying is one option. It's really expensive option. They have tried freezing it, and they have tried fermenting it with lactic acid bacteria, and that's what they're doing at the moment. Mostly, I think around 80 to 90% is fermented for different customers, and now they are also trying to ferment and dry. Some customers would like fermented and dried. All of their production, or they are aiming for that all of their production will go into to feed for animals and food for people, and cosmetics and health products, because biofuel is a low product. It's a low value product, and it's you cannot, in our high salary environment, labor cost is so high that you have to go in for the high value products, and they are aiming for those products. And part of the research project is not only bringing down cost and developing new methods to produce seaweed, but also new methods of using the seaweed. So some products are part of the project.
That's fascinating. It will be really interesting to see how it develops in the next few years. Our UHI partners down in Sams on the west coast of Scotland are currently still involved with some seaweed work. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see how things develop.
Yes.
And John, you had a question?
Yeah, just really a very, very brief question to Magni. And there's the beginnings now of some interest in Scotland, including Shetland, in trying to decarbonize the vessel costs. I mean, it's somebody earlier made the point. I think it may have been you, Ragnhild, about sea transport being a huge part of carbon footprint, and does the technology exist to allow that to be reduced? For day vessels going out for a day and coming back, and for fish farm work vessels, there's now some interesting developments with electricity, with electrical motors on board and heavy battery packs which are charged every night. So I just wondered if there's anything similar in Faroe. It's very small scale in Scotland at the moment, but it's the beginnings of an interesting development to electrify the small vessels, whether fishing or fish farming.
Yeah, for fish farmers, there's one vessel in Faroe Islands that is electrified. For the rest of the fishing industry, they have looked at a lot of different options. I've been involved in some of them, so I know about some of the projects. They've looked at at natural gas as one step going in hydrogen. They have looked at different. The problem is that if you go to natural gas or if you go to hydrogen, you actually have to convert your fishing vessel into a kind of a tanker. So it's going to be huge. The storage space for the energy needed is really huge compared to when you have oil. The other problem is that you have to compress most of it. So are you going to use liquefied natural gas? The hydrogen, what are you going to do with it? You're going to freeze it. So oil is quite a convenient product compared to most of the other energy sources. So at the moment, most of the focus is on electrifying the households for heating, and the cars, the land transportation, if you could call that, while the fishing vessels, they are trying to find ways to reduce their oil consumption rather than to shift into any other energy source. So it's more about reduction and that kind of thing.
That's fine, thanks.
Thank you very much. I think we'll keep the other questions until the end, so that if you've got something that you really want to ask Magni, we can do it then. I'll just say thank you very much for those thought-provoking research projects, Magni, and I'm sure we'll come back to that shortly. And we'll move on now briefly away from the fishing industries to knitwear. So hello, Faroes. I'd like to take over.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much. Yeah, I'll try to share my screen. Let's see.
That's it.
Okay. Oh. And see it myself. Let me see. My screen became very small.
Well, it's sharing fine, but it's sharing the whole screen, not it's not in presentation mode.
Okay. Let me see. How is it now? Is it?
Yep, it's on your second slide. It's on the Islands of Sheep. There we go.
It's okay now?
I think what we're seeing is we're seeing your presentation page, but it's absolutely fine. Don't worry about that. We can see the main screen, main slide, and then we can see what's coming up. But that's absolutely fine.
Okay. Okay, I'll just start.
Excellent.
So thank you very much. Yeah, I'm Firouz Gaini from University of the Faroe Islands, and I was also at the first symposium. I'm a professor in anthropology, and I've been working on youth cultures, youth studies, and actually knitting is not my expertise, but I have through one of my research networks, I have gone into that area through the back door, so to speak. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the position of Faroese knitwear especially the sweater, in fashion and culture in the Faroe Islands today. And yeah, so the Faroe Islands, or Føroyar as it's called in the Faroes, means islands of sheep, according to etymologists. At least that's the main theory. And so clearly sheep and wool is very central for the Faroe Islands. And there are around 75,000 sheep in the Faroes, compared to roughly 55,000 inhabitants. The coat of arms of the Faroe Islands depicts a ram with golden yellow hooves and horns. And we have the Seyabrevet, the sheep letter from 1298, a royal decree representing the oldest Faroese code of law, mainly dealing with sheep husbandry. So there are a lot of symbols and cultural artifacts in the Faroe Islands indicating the central position of sheep and wool in our history. Wool is the Faroese gold, says an old proverb, emphasizing the priceless value of textile fiber obtained from sheep, which at least since the beginning of the 16th century has been used for the practice of knitting with needles, as we know today. So, and the image of the wool as the Faroese gold got a special meaning or a strengthened meaning when the woolen garments, after the introduction of new spinning wheels, became the main export industry in the 17th century. That was before the fisheries that we have talked about for the last hour, fishing industry. Practically everyone could participate in this booming enterprise, men and women across all age groups and social classes. And it was an export for the whole of the European market. Production of socks was huge compared to the population. Around 100,000 pairs sold annually in the mid-18th century, for example. Later, the sweater, the patterned sweater, became the most valuable garment for export. In 1849, when only around 8,000 inhabitants lived in the Faroes, the Royal Danish monopoly received more than 100,000 sweaters for 14,000 pairs of socks from their colony in the Nordic Atlantic, from the Faroes. So there was even an overproduction. And in 1717, during the Great Nordic War, the Rentekammeret, the commercial bureau of the Danish state, approved the destruction of 123,000 pairs of socks because they had been, as they said, eaten by moths and maggots. So the production went wild in some periods. But in the late 19th century, when the Faroes take their first steps towards becoming a modern industrial fishing society, fishery products gradually substituted wool as main export article. And you can say that a decline or long-term decline of export of knitwear started. And in the end of the 20th century, the youth generation seemed to also to lose interest in this cultural activity, even if there are people knitting, but somehow knitting lost ground as a cultural tradition among many islanders. And the wool islands or the Faroe Islands ended up literally burning its gold when the local wool towards the end of the 20th century became practically unsaleable. nobody seemed to care much about the fact that this part of the history went up in smoke. The tradition of knitting clubs and knitting didn't disappear, but there were fewer knitters, fewer young knitters, and also a larger and larger portion of the yarn was imported also, and less produced locally. But then we have what I have called, chosen to call a kind of woolen turn and comeback of the sweater in the 21st century, and a revival of the knitwear, which is linked to international networks and also global activism, focusing on a better and more sustainable future for fashion. We have made the Faroese realize that the things we make here on the islands are great, says Gurun Rekvadottir, who is part of the Gurun and Gurun brand. And she continues and says, "We know our knitting needles and we should be proud of it." So the wool is somehow being reinvented by creative entrepreneurs with the deep roots in the Faroese knitting culture, but also a very global mind or a global orientation in the projects. So as mentioned, much of the wool produced in the Faroes is burned today and thrown away. And until very recently, people didn't discuss it. It was almost like accepted or it was taken for granted. But now more and more people are also feeling frustrated and trying to revitalize this part of the Faroese culture. So you can say that the woolen turn of Faroese, the woolen turn in Faroese fashion is about wool generally, but also about specifically about Faroese wool. So when I'm talking about yarn and garments, which I'm not an expert in at all, but I talk about it with the interviewees in my project, I constantly touch upon this topic. Faroese or not Faroese wool in the yarn, produced, hand-produced or machine-produced, mixed yarn, etc. And they reflect on what you could call the Faroese-ness of their products in relation to questions about pure or mixed wool hand-knitted at home or abroad, traditional or novel patterns, and so on. Beita Poulsen, who is one of the designers, fashion designers in the Faroe Islands, and she is behind the brand called Einstakt, which means unique. She says in an article, "We use a lot of hand knitting and we get inspired by the old Faroese patterns. Sometimes we use them as they are and sometimes we mend them a bit into our own." Another important designer in the Faroes, Johanna af Steinum, she says that she sees patterns everywhere. She explains, "I do love using those old patterns from the pattern books, but the fun part for me is mixing the old with my own patterns, the patterns that I might find abroad. And the fusing between pattern and color is the most fun part for me." And Gurun Ludvig from the Gurun and Gurun brand, which is composed of two women called Gurun. Gurun Ludvig is the architect behind the famous, at least in the Nordic area, a so-called star sweater, which was worn by Sara Lund, a Danish, a character in the Danish crime series The Killing, which made Gurun becoming more famous or more known abroad than they had been before that. And this sweater with this what is also called the snowflake pattern on a white sweater with black patterns from the series, it's a variation of the traditional star motif. And Gurun says that she really wanted to make the sweater or the traditional seaman sweater suitable for urban women. So it's also a kind of reconfiguration or remolding of an old style associated with a special worker or fisherman. Now it's becoming more urban, and it's also more feminine, you could say, maybe, compared to the old sweater. She explained that she used her father's worn woolen jumper as model. Then she made it shorter, lighter, and softer. Yeah. And Sissel Christiansen, another fashion designer and social entrepreneur that owns the brand Shisa, she is very inspired also by Japanese street arts and street fashion. She says that her brand is called Shisa because when she stayed in Japan, they couldn't pronounce her name and they said Shisa instead of Sissel, and that became the name of her brand. And she talks about the Japanese connection and says that she says that she's half Faroese, half Japanese in her working mind. And when I meet her for an interview, she's wearing one of her best sellers, which is a sweater called Tokyo. So that's also a kind of globalization in the business. And Sissel Christiansen from Shisa brand, who is, as mentioned, inspired by Japanese streetwear. She says there is a match between Japanese aesthetics and Faroese wool and Faroese expression. There are aesthetic similarities, she claims, between the countries, and that is also something that is echoed or you can see resonated in some of the other brands, for instance, Barbara Ugonchne, but also Gurun and Gurun. Which might represent a kind of new inspiration in an old knitting culture. Yeah, and Barbara Ugonchne, another fashion designer, Faroese, but based in Denmark, Copenhagen. She says about her style and work, she's more experimental in many ways. She says, I don't concretely work with cultural heritage, like patterns that can be traced to a national costume or anything of that sort. I always had the urge to rise up against the dogma of things. So she stretches, you can say, the borders or her designs further away from the traditional Faroese. Like most other Faroese contemporary designers, she mixes styles still from the local and the global cultural trends in her garments. And there is a Faroese reference, she says, in her design. Yeah, the knitwear designers, most of whom are happily operating in small-scale production, are all in one way or the other emphasizing their commitment to this woolen turn starting in the 21st century as a movement towards more sustainable knitwear production in the island community. Yeah, I'm not checking the time. I have a few more minutes, or?
Yes, yeah, a few more minutes.
Yeah,
Faroes.
okay. So, and Gurun, they reflect on their attachment or roots in the Faroe Islands, also regarding where their shops and their workplace is located. And they say that there would never have been Gurun and Gurun as it looks today if it had been in Paris, based in Paris or in another, or in London or somewhere else. They have to be in the Faroe Islands. It's here that they get their inspiration, not only from the cultural heritage and the knitting culture, but also from the everyday life, what they see and what they smell and what they feel and what they hear. And that's what makes them exotic or different when they are participating in fashion fairs abroad. So this woolen turn is facilitating the comeback of the Faroese sweater, as I call it. And the new trend is not only visible in the collections of professional companies or professional brands, there is also a kind of trend or new interest in knitting in the population, in the Faroes as well as globally. New knitting workshops, seminars, and knitting festivals affecting aficionados from all age groups. And there, you still also have the traditional so-called knitting clubs, especially among Faroese women. But as mentioned, there are fewer and fewer of the younger generation who are actively participating in these groups, and some of them learn to knit on Instagram instead of learning it from their older siblings or their mother. So you can say that the sweater is not just a sweater anymore. It's also a story of value chains and of local global connections. It also has an environmental footprint and a point of identification. The knitted sweater is back, and it serves as a depository of memories, identities, and also future dreams. And the Faroese patterned sweater, which is locally embedded yet also immersed in global flows of fashion, it has the potential of endless variation as handmade garment. You could say that you could maybe say that it's a bit like a wearable Persian rug. Sometimes it's something that you want to keep for a long time, something that even improves with age and which has a story and maybe secrets in its patterns. And small-scale production is the local answer to the predicament of unsustainable industrial production. And the Faroese designers who have been mentioned here are strategically using the international movement for more sustainable and locally embedded fashion in the definition of their brands, values, and visions. But they are at the same time also focusing on the multi-local and multicultural expression of the knitwear. As, for example, when we talked about the Japanese connection in Shisa brand. So the experimental bricolage, which tailors the sweater, is the result of indigenous mixing, you can say, of old and new styles, satisfying the needs and wishes of the customer. The fashion of the sweater is an individual creative choice rather than a group mandate. And I'm almost there, finished. So in a way, it has become fashionable or chic to wear the knit today. And the sweater has also been diversified to fit into most wardrobes. You find them undyed, naturally colored, or hand knitted in the Faroe Islands, or hand knitted in other parts of the world, for example, regarding Gurun and Gurun products. You have machine knitted, or based on pure Faroese wool, or blended wool, etc. With a Japanese touch, or and so on. Of course, you might also just inherit a sweater or simply knit it yourself. So knitting and unknitting the Faroese fashion, I have tried to demonstrate how global currents and crises and local challenges together have given the wool a second chance, and how young Faroese designers and entrepreneurs have used their cultural capital and global network to reinvent this patterned sweater. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Faroes, for that sort of exploration of the creative practice and the economic benefit of knitting to the Faroe Islands, and that has so many similarities with Shetland at the moment. I just put in a link there to the a conference that the Centre for Island Creativity ran early in September, along with Shetland Museum and Archives, which looked at knitting, lace making, patted rugs, all sorts of different things. And there's clearly great scope for the exploration of woolen goods and the the importance of creative practice between the Faroe Islands and Shetland. And the Gurun and Gurun, I think it was one of their jumpers that you put up, one of their Ganses had the star pattern, which is a really kind of important aspect of Shetland, I think, as well. So thank you very much. So does anyone have a question or comment for Faroes? Yeah, Vivica.
It actually ties into one of the questions that I had from Magni. I was kind of curious about where in the ranking the land-based economy would be in this. The top 5 didn't include that, but the woolen industry is very much a land-based industry. Now, if that is getting an upswing, is that bringing the land-based economy higher up in this list of what brings income to Faroe? And I'm thinking about the parallels here in Shetland. We've just a month ago finished with an international festival called the Shetland Wool Week, which brings hundreds of people to Shetland. It's all based around wool in various ways, and it has led to especially young women, being able to create their own businesses. So this is a sustainable development in having localized businesses for localized solutions, which of course ties into the whole issue of carbon and, you know, making use of what we have on the islands and making the most of it. And instead of dumping it and burning it, making it into, you know, wool and gold. That really ties in with the global, like you say, it ties in with the global trend anyway in sustainability and durability of products. So I was wondering if there's any indication as to whether the upswing in the value of wool, because it leads to designs and I think we're going to get knitwear festivals in Faroe too eventually. I hear murmurings of that. So does that push the land-based economy up the list a bit? I'm wondering.
Yeah, the calculations of the importance of different industries is based on a theory called export-led growth, or it's also called current account restricted economies. It actually means that every economic activity has some import factor to it, and the only thing that can pay for import is export. So the export level is restricting our economies in small areas. So it's called current account restricted economies, because the current account is actually restricting the size of the economy. So which sectors are important? When I say the 5 sectors, fisheries, aquaculture, block grant from Denmark, people working abroad, and then the 5th sector was, I called it tourism. Tourism is actually a broader category than just tourism, but tourism is the largest part of that one. It also includes like insurance and telecommunications services that we provide to other countries. So there are other in that, and sweaters and that kind of thing are part of what I call tourism. I only call it tourism because that's the largest part of that grouping. But it's tourism and other service that we provide to abroad. So when you ask whether festivals or knitting, or it could be music, if you have export of music, we also have that, or telecommunications or whatever it is, they will all contribute to a larger economy in Faroe Islands or in that region. It's actually it's exactly the same in Shetland or in Scotland, or even if you take UK as a region. They are all export-led economies. Not all economies are. So United States is not an export-led economy, but most small economies are, and even UK economy is a small in the global in the global picture. So when we calculate the importance of different sectors, we calculate it through the export sector, but it's not like if you say, well, it's 10% of the export and then it's 10% of the economy. It's not as simple as that. You also have to consider all of the multiplication or multiplier effect on the economy. But as a simple rule of thumb, you could just say 10% of the income at the export value would be 10% of the economy.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, let's keep that in mind for discussing, and we'll go on to a slightly different research area, but of course very important for both of our institutions. So Simon's going to talk about island-based tertiary education, which is all up for grabs at the moment. Interesting situation, but I don't know if you'll be going into that. But Simon, if you'd like to take over.
Yeah. So if I remember how to share my screen on this one. So yeah, here we go. Okay, so that should be coming through shortly.
It is.
Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about really is particularly the use of networked higher education as part of the University of the Highlands and Islands. And I should say, just first of all, just say that my original background was in archaeology. So I spent quite a lot of time looking backwards, but I'm also fascinated by the technology of education. And to give you a little bit of the background associated with this, I came to Shetland in 1998 to take part in a project which had been set up. It was still a project at that stage rather than a university. And we were a group of 15 independent educational and research institutions associated with about a further 50 learning centres spread throughout the Highlands and Islands. And the premise of the project to set up a university for the Highlands and Islands was that new technology was going to allow a university to be viable really for the first time, that you could assemble large enough cohorts of students and you could assemble the diversity of skill sets that you would need to offer a genuinely higher educational experience by networking, a collaboration across the region. So in terms of it's worth just recounting very, very quickly the progress that has been made within this. The situation has changed quite a lot over the last 25 years. We initially were offering degrees validated by other institutions, by the Open University Validation Service, and overseen by sponsor institutions. I think Aberdeen, Strathclyde and Edinburgh universities were our sponsors originally. We achieved higher education provider status in 2001 and became the UHI Millennium Institute. Rather hilariously, at that point, we weren't allowed to say what the U, the H and the I stood for. So we were actually listed within UCAS as UM, where the U stood for UHI. And there were very stern emails sent around about we must not put dots between the letters because then it would imply that the U stood for university, and we were not yet chartered. So we went on to produce our first honours graduates in 2006, and we became a fully chartered university in 2011. So we've come quite a long way, and it's also important to say that the technology, which we rather naively thought would make a university viable for the first time, has also come a long way. So looking back to the first video conference equipment that we used is kind of hilarious now. So this, on the left-hand side, we have the old style cathode ray tube televisions with a state-of-the-art video conference unit, which gave quite a low-grade picture, and it operated using ISDN 2 or ISDN 6 telephone lines. So it was insanely expensive in terms of telephone bills. The only reason we were able to do it at all was because we had our own private telephone network across the university project area. And so it was absolutely confined to the campuses at that time. In the very early 21st century, that situation shifted, and ISDN was replaced by international protocol video conferencing. And we also saw some upgrading of the hardware as well at the user end. So flat screen televisions, and we moved. So just to say, on this image here, you can see that there's a video conference taping machine. If you wanted to tape a session and share it with students that weren't able to take part, you had to physically take the recording and then post it out to them. So quite an absurd level of inconvenience to actually achieve the university service that we aspired to. So by the time of the middle image here, sort of around about 2006, you were looking at much more sophisticated video conferencing suites, routinely had access to screen sharing, which was very unusual back in the very earliest days of the video conferencing. And then in the third slide, we see a really important development, which was the development of PC-based or laptop-based video conferencing provision, using software that could be operated from a personal computer. That brought the cost down hugely. So that was available from about 2007. So the technology that we're actually using has developed quite quickly, but also has been around for a little while. And so the other thing to say is that how we've used the technology has shifted significantly as well. So for a while we've been allowing more students to operate from off campus. So we have moved gradually from most students coming on campus and taking part in VC suite-based activities, so a smaller number of centres, but with larger groups of people participating. But more recently, what's taken over is almost exclusively single individuals with their own camera on their own equipment. And obviously, since the pandemic, that off campus has become particularly important. So there are some really important changes that have taken place within the technology and also the social sphere of how this technology operates. The COVID pandemic was an absolute watershed moment for the central technology, video conferencing. As I say, the PC-based video conferencing has been around from 2007, but it was really with the pandemic that large parts of the public came in contact with video conferencing as a daily necessity on a large scale. So not social distancing, but physical distancing requirements really force people to work and study from home as the new normal. We can see here on the right the huge drop in transport activity. The figures are taken largely from London, national rail use and car use, but local tube and bus services in London. But the pattern is broadly similar across all regions of Britain, in actual fact. And what I really want to emphasize is that this has actually established a new paradigm which is as important as the technological changes which have taken place as well. I don't have statistics to back this up for Shetland, but what I would just say is if you came to Shetland College prior to the pandemic and you arrived significantly after 9 o'clock, you were searching for a car parking space. The car park is now half empty. So there has been a huge change in how the campus is used. And that is largely because a lot more people are working from home and are studying from home as well. And that has really important implications that I want us to think about a little later on in the talk. So I'm a huge fan of this technology. I would perhaps blush slightly to say it, but UHI had a good pandemic. We were the best prepared institution in Britain, just about, to go forward with distance delivery of our programs. We had staff that actually had a fair knowledge base to actually take forward the technology and apply it to many areas of teaching that had not previously been used with. We had a huge stock of equipment that we were able to use, and crucially, Britain was also at a stage where its broadband provision was quite strong out in the community as well as in the campuses. So that's not been the case in every country, and in terms of the skill base, it's certainly not been true in every institution. So as I say, I'm a huge fan of this technology, but the first thing to say is, whoops, crashing through a whole load of slides there, which I didn't intend to do. Okay, so this is a slide which shows the student satisfaction broken down by age groups. And what you can see here is that the youngest students are the least satisfied with video conferencing. They're very small proportion, or relatively small proportion, have an overwhelmingly positive experience compared with a very high proportion, well over 50% for the older age group. And it's you know, this slope going up on this side of the diagram is matched by a slope going down on the other side, with relatively small numbers of older people dissatisfied with their experience of learning and teaching using video conference technology. So the first thing to say is that this immediately gives the lie to the idea that there's such a thing as digital natives. The use of video conferencing as a regular part of teaching and learning is not really a technological challenge anymore. It's a communication challenge, and the older students, the older people in the community actually are the ones that are most comfortable and confident in communication more generally. So that's the first thing to say. So this works better for higher education than it does for further education. And further education probably works better than it does for school-age children. It's not really about the level of the education. So one of the things which is quite interesting, I've also got graphs for looking at postgraduate versus undergraduate and the different years of undergraduate provision. And there isn't really a strong pattern within that. It's more to do with the age of the students and their confidence as communicators rather than the level of the topic that they're talking about. Okay. The other thing to say is that some subjects are much more easily dealt with by this technology than others as well. So the standout group here is really the humanities. The humanities has had the strongest uptake of video conferencing supported learning of any of the degree level subject areas within UHI. So it has the most experienced staff. I think it would also be true to say that this is a subject area which lends itself to this kind of distance experience, where you've got art, where you've got science subjects, where you've got engineering and things like that with significant practical elements. The wholly off-campus experience is much less satisfactory. But as I say, it is also complicated by the fact that the staff in those areas and the students have less experience of working with the medium prior to the pandemic. So these statistics which were gathered during the pandemic are a compound of the underlying difficulty of the technical challenge of teaching in this format, and the experience of the participants, both the staff and the students. Something I don't have statistics for, but I am also very aware of, is a significant blind spot that UHI has, which is its failure really to develop the distance experience for university. There hasn't been much of a focus on social technology to actually facilitate extracurricular activities, and that's the social isolation that everybody experienced during the pandemic is one aspect of that. But as a dispersed population, the Highlands and Islands has a particular problem. We don't have the critical mass of people with a particular minority interest to bring together small clubs and societies of the sort that you would expect to flourish in a university environment. So that there isn't a chess club, there aren't sports clubs, there aren't Dungeons and Dragons clubs or political debating societies or special interest groups associated with particular hobbies or whatever. And I think this is a huge failure on the part of UHI that we really need to address if we're going to fully succeed as a university experience. So that's kind of a race through the subject, really. As I say, I'm a huge enthusiast for the UHI project of making higher education available to and from the Highlands and Islands. I think the technology is clearly a very important part of the success story of that. But there's also a huge human component which is necessary to make this succeed. And so, looking forward, I think what I would like to emphasize is that really a combination of changes in the technology and the pandemic mean that the future of video conferencing for educational delivery is going to be off campus. Staff and students, even after the COVID restrictions have been relaxed now for some time, have pretty much voted with their feet. A lot of people are wanting to work remotely, and that has knock-on consequences for the on-campus experience of those that would want to come onto the campus. Most of their mates are online, basically. In terms of what we need to do going forward, we need to acknowledge that VC works much better for some subjects than others, and there will be a need to blend the learning experience so that elements that don't work well remotely are still supported. There is a need for a practical component in many subjects. We also need to acknowledge that a remote experience doesn't work for all types of students. Younger students, I've demonstrated, struggle with the social isolation that's associated with this type of program. But also, within that, you've got groups that don't necessarily have a good home learning environment. They don't have broadband maybe that's adequate, or they don't have a space that's, away from the kids or away from their siblings, or all the distractions of, the hoovering and the washing up and things like that needs doing, and so on. Separation of work and study is necessary for some people to get them out of the house. So there will be a need for campuses of some description that people have the option of going to. And as I say, we've got this huge problem of social isolation, of how do we build a social dynamic beyond the actual curriculum content, because a university should be more than just learning the content and doing the exams. There is a social dynamic to the whole graduate experience, or there should be. So going forward, this leads me to a number of not answers, but questions that we need to ask ourselves as an institution. We need to think seriously about the governance model. I would argue it's not really working. We have duplication of management in many different centres. They are not a collaborative network. They are a competing set of bureaucrats that largely cancel each other out, and we can't afford anymore. We need to think about what sort of campus network we actually need. You know, what the buildings we've got were what we had ambitions for 25 years ago. Society has moved on, the technology has moved on, the needs of the students have moved on. How many centres do we need, and where do they need to be, and what character do they need to have? And we need to think much more clearly about the strategy for learning and teaching using this technology for blended delivery. At the moment, it's very much do what you feel. The management aren't really giving a clear lead or offering clear insights into what's working and what should be duplicated and what should be deleted in terms of what we're doing. Everything is about cost and other audit points, but not about the student experience, and that there needs to be much more focus on that. Anyway, as I say, some negative things there, but overall, I'm very, very positive about the technology, and I don't want to give you the impression everything is bleak. There's lots of bleakness, but there's lots of exciting stuff going on as well.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Thanks for the sort of conclusions about where to go next. And there's a question in the chat from Osla. Maybe you could answer that in the text. I think we'll need to move on, but it's a related subject. It's about youth migration, and of course maintaining a youth population in Shetland that might want to attend UHI Shetland is part of our goals. So if Rosie, if you'd like to, oh sorry, it was going to be Erica, but well, I've mentioned Rosie because we've just carried on. So Rosie, if you'd like to tell us about the role of career routes in island youth migration, and then we'll finish off with Erica telling us about immigration and social change in the Faroe Islands.
Yeah, I think what I'm going to say will follow on quite well, perhaps, from what Simon has just presented. So I'm just going to see if I can find my presentation and share it. I think that should be coming on your screens. Could you let me know when you can see it?
There it is.
There it is. Okay. So yeah, see if I can find a clock to try and keep myself to time. Yeah. So what I want to talk about is island youth migration. I'm going to talk specifically about my perspective, which focuses on career. And right at the end of the presentation, I'll have some points, I think, around the purposes of higher education and further education in the islands, things to think about from what I've said. So the background to my work is I'm very interested in issues of population change in islands. We have long-standing concerns in most island communities around youth depopulation. They appear in Scotland in the Scottish Population Strategy and in the National Islands Plan. And even in island communities where the population is relatively level or stable, like Orkney, where I'm speaking from, we have concerns over population balance. So disproportionate numbers of older people compared to younger people. And so youth migration and youth out-migration remain a concern. My particular entry into research was really that I'm aware that a lot of research would think about education opportunities or employment opportunities as a stimulus for out-migration of young people. And my background is I was a careers advisor for a very long time, so helping young people to make decisions about education and employment in schools and at UHI. So I was at UHI for a long time. And as a careers advisor, I'm aware that decisions about employment and education are not taken just at one point in time, they're taken in relation to futures. So I think a career focus is quite useful when thinking about youth migration, because it can help us recognise how individual decisions about what to do are not just based right now, but they're based on actually where do I want to go in the future, and that provides a different way of thinking about youth migration. Another thing that a career focus offers, I think, is a recognition that there are specific routes with specific qualifications, which is not always recognised in the policy context. So the policy context tends to talk about increasing higher education or increasing graduate jobs or increasing good jobs in order to retain young people or to attract young people. It doesn't necessarily recognise that different jobs require different qualifications, and I think a career focus can help us to think about that. So my work really, a lot of my work, I spent 8 years doing my PhD. My PhD looked at the experiences of 22 higher education students from Orkney and Shetland who had lived in Orkney or Shetland before undertaking higher education, but could have studied anywhere. I interviewed them at the point of graduation and then a year later about their decisions to go into higher education and then their decisions afterwards and how their journeys progressed. In terms of findings, my work would say, in line with a lot of the evidence, that higher education is strongly associated with leaving. So 20 out of 22 of the graduates in my research graduated from mainland institutions, 2 graduated from UHI. For a lot of these students, leaving is common sense. These are particularly students who are academically very able and who have parents who have gone to university. So your traditional university students tend to entirely assume that they're going to leave and they're going to go to university. And those 2 expressions are used interchangeably. So going away and going to university is the same thing. It is important to note that there is a significant proportion, a small but significant proportion, I guess, of my graduates, about 7, who take non-traditional routes into higher education. They enter the workplace, they might engage with further education through UHI or an HNC or something like that through UHI. But basically, if you interviewed these young people at the point of going into higher education, you would see that higher education is associated with leaving, opportunities are associated with leaving, but I would say that's not the whole story. And the reason it's not the whole story is that for many of these graduates or students, they are making decisions about what to do, where to study and what to study based on their futures. And many of these young people are envisaging futures back in the islands. And there's a lot of work from the Faroe Islands, and Erica's work particularly looking at patterns of return, youth return to the islands. So we know that this is a pattern in other island communities as well, and it's certainly something that came out of my research. When young people are thinking about potentially returning in the future, they're thinking about returning in a certain way. So they're thinking about returning often to settle down, that's the phrase, settle down. This involves normally settling in a relationship and often having children, wanting to bring up children in the community that you grew up in, for example. But it also involves having a good enough job or career. So like something where you can feel engaged and where you can contribute maybe, which has a little bit of stretch or offers you some personal and professional development. And settling down also involves settling in a place that you want to be in. So for many of these students, it is returning to the islands. Some students don't particularly see that they're going to be able to return to the islands, and they might imagine futures which are in places that are like the islands, often rural Scotland. But I would say all of these students are envisaging. They see when they're young being a period of high mobility, but when they envisage their future, they envisage more settled futures. And there's a quote there from a graduate which sums up this pattern, this idea of returning to settle down and have a family and have a good job. So from this lens, leaving for some people is a way of achieving the ability to settle, to return. And it's like a renegotiation of a relationship to a place. So it's like moving from being a child in a family setup, You go away, you develop a professional identity, and you come back and you are in a different relationship to that place. And again, Faroes's work in the Faroe Islands is interesting, I think, in this respect too. So there's another link. It's another reason why I'm delighted to be here in this symposium, because I think there are a lot of links between the Northern Isles in Scotland and the Faroe Islands. So yeah, so leaving is a way of establishing a career for some people. This is gendered to a certain extent. It's a very interesting conversation earlier about the fishing industry, which would traditionally be quite gendered towards men. Young women in their communities and in this research would tend to say, some of them say, there are no opportunities for young women, or there are very limited opportunities for young women to have a good career in the community. And the careers that they identify as good careers for women, often healthcare like nursing or education like teaching, are careers that at the time that this research was done, both pretty much require leaving. So you need to go away to get the qualification to then be able to work in your community. Other students would opt to take subjects like business. Business would leave their options open for a potential return. So these are students who are maybe less clear that they want to study something like healthcare or education, but they want to leave their options open. And business is something that you could study at the time of this research in both Shetland and Orkney. So the different kind of career decisions that people are making frame their spatial decisions, whether they go away or not, and they're making career decisions based on their anticipated spatial futures as well. When you get to graduation, it all gets quite complicated, as anybody who works with graduates in the UK will tell you. Transition into the workplace after a degree is sometimes a bit bumpy, a bit difficult. And young people can find that their aspirations to return get a little bit complicated sometimes. So some young people, particularly those in vocational routes like nursing and teaching and those kinds of things, might find that they can't return immediately because they have to stay in their professions. So they have to find work wherever that work is. And it might involve waiting for a job to come up back in the islands, or it might involve doing additional training in your chosen profession. Interestingly, those who stayed and graduated, there were only 2 of them, but both of them looked at opportunities elsewhere, and one of them did move elsewhere. So this idea that you study locally at UHI and remain within your community isn't particularly upheld by this research. You know, young people are looking at going away, maybe to generate the career opportunities they need, and then perhaps return again in the future. There are some young people who take on high-profile graduate schemes or graduate jobs. These are very beloved of university career services, typically in the UK. But for these students, what that normally means is you've got to be willing to move potentially to England or even internationally to access these big graduate schemes with big multinational employers. And then finally, you have a group of graduates who are interested in professions where there is no clear kind of training route, or which requires a lot of work experience. You might need to work your way up in a job. Now, these young people are quite interesting because they often find that they cannot stay away, or that their opportunity to stay away is very limited, because if they can't get a job which earns enough money, they can't afford to live independently. And so they might return to the islands much more quickly than they would want to live with family in cheaper accommodation, to live back with families of origin or with a partner. So that's the complication of career routes. And then there's also complications with partners and settling down, because some young people who make relationships with people who are based on the Scottish mainland, for example, feel that returning to Orkney or Shetland would be much more difficult because their partner might not want to move. And conversely, those who graduate and have partners who are in the islands find it much more difficult maybe to remain away, and are likely to move back sometimes before they're entirely ready or feel ready in terms of their career. I'm aware of time. And I think what I'll do is I just kind of skip this slide, but this was a sort of typology of different sorts of people who return, different graduates who return to Orkney and Shetland 6 months after graduation, and I've kind of split them into different levels of settled how settled they feel in communities. But broadly, this is where I want to get to. So I feel that career decisions take place across time and space. Imagined futures are spatialized, but they're also unpredictable and emergent. And I think when we think about youth out-migration, we need to think beyond staying and leaving binaries and recognize that stayers for higher education might then leave, leavers might return, and so on. And I think we need to think beyond opportunities and towards careers, or at least longer term routes when we think about youth mobility. And here is the link to Simon's presentation. So I've done a little bit of thinking from my PhD about whether we could think about on-island further and higher education in a slightly different way. So beyond retaining young people in islands, could we be thinking about higher education as sometimes facilitating leaving, but also facilitating attraction of young people and supporting returners. So maybe people who have graduated from an undergraduate degree elsewhere, but who are looking for postgraduate options, for example. How would it change the way we think about higher education in islands? And then some particular questions I think I have around people who return because of difficulties accessing suitably high paid employment elsewhere, who return straight after graduation. I have a kind of interest in, we do have young people in our islands, of course we do. So how are we helping those young people to be a useful resource in our communities, to contribute to our communities and potentially to stay in a longer term way? Can we be thinking about additional support for young graduates, for example? How do we support on-island training and access to employment? Could we be supporting those young people to go away if necessary to get additional skills and experience in the professions they want to train in? So that is what I have to say. And let's see if I can stop sharing now.
Thank you very much indeed, Rosie, and some potential research that needs to be done, and research that could perhaps be paralleled in the Faroe Islands as well, because that's one of the things that we want to consider today. Now, it was notionally 4 o'clock we stopped, but we can actually run over. There's no problem. Nothing gets, we don't get decapitated or whatever. So we can continue, which means that there's no rush for Erica. There's plenty of time to tell us about immigration into the Faroe Islands, and then we can engage perhaps with the other aspect of this meeting, which is looking at research that we could do together, or that we could, at least parallel what others are doing, and address some of the questions that have come up about sustainability, autonomy, islanding versus metropole policies, etc. So I think we'll carry on till 4:30. So there we go. If need be, but we'll just hold the question about bringing people in to go to university. That's what we do in the Institute for Northern Studies, by the way. We do try and attract people in to come and do their master's degrees, and we hope that they're then going to stay. We have a couple of tier 4 students who have their visas, who've come one from the States and the others from Germany, come to live, one in Orkney and one in Shetland. So they're coming and they're contributing to society. So we're doing that in a way, Rosie, but it's something that we would like to research and extend and expand in future, and it's definitely a really interesting piece of research needing done. So we will then continue considering migration, but we'll look at immigration in the Faroe Islands with Erica. Hello, Erica.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Right, so I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Erica Hayfield. I'm based at the University of the Faroe Islands. My research areas include primarily migration, and that's both out-migration and immigration, which involve different sets of people, but are about the demography and social changes on the islands. But also, I'm very interested in gender and the labour market. That's something that I focus on. and research ethics. But throughout all the topics that I research, the issue of being, or the social dynamics of being a small island community seems to rear its head the whole time. So I've never been able to sort of get away with it. So now it's just part of everything I do. Yeah, so I'm at the Department of History and Social Science, and I'm an associate professor here. So let me just kick off with the presentation, and I'm going to time my presentation so that I'm not too long. Let's see. Now, how do I do this? Is it application or screen that I'm to share? I've not used this platform to present on before.
Well, you could try either one. Probably application would be the easiest one.
Right, let's see. Window. There it is. Can you see anything there?
There we can, yes. A nice picture of Saxon.
Yeah. And are you seeing my larger screen now?
Yeah, we're seeing just the slide itself. Yep.
Presentation mode, right?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you. Right. So I'll be talking about immigration today and social change in the Faroe Islands. And this is based on various empirical work that I've done, but it's interviews from 2017, 2018, 2023, mainly with immigrants, but also with government officials and municipality officials, various professions as well, and also multiple informal talks and interaction with the communities. Now, for many, many, many years, the Faroe Islands has been ethnically and culturally homogenous. So having many different ethnicities here is not something that we're used to. But of late, we've had a vast increase in immigration of non-Faroese people. And that's especially within the past 10, 15 years, which is similar to many other Arctic regions and also, for example, Iceland. And it's obviously connected to globalization, where immigration is moving from merely being concentrated in metropoles and large cities to more peripheral areas. People come for, their entry mode is mainly work and family reunification, although more recently, because we've had very low unemployment, almost zero, and a larger demand for work migrants, the immigration procedures have been made more simple, if you like, and fast, so that we've had a large increase in people coming in for work-based reasons. So we're faced with the reality of having more diversity in Faroese society. If you look at citizenship from 2009 to 2023, the green line represents Faroese citizens, that is a person living in the Faroe Islands with a Faroese stroke Danish citizenship, and the brown line is for all countries. We can see that from 2009 to 2023, the gap has become larger. Now, the amount of people in the Faroe Islands who are not Faroese citizens is now around 3,000, which is a lot in a population of 54,000. Of course, then there's also people who have got their Danish citizenship. So add that, then there's quite a lot. And so the amount of people has gone from 2% of the population in 2009 to 6%. So that's a large increase. So where are they coming from? Well, here are the regions. It's primarily the purple columns that where there's a large increase, and that's Europe. A lot of these people are Polish and Eastern European male workers who are coming in to work as manual laborers, but also Eastern European women who come partly to be family reunified with their Faroese husband, or also come for work. The green columns are people from Asia, and that's primarily people from the Philippines and from Thailand. And a lot of those are women who come and have been family reunified with Faroese husbands, but increasingly also male workers as well. So there's a big jump in immigration. So what are the key challenges that are impacting migrants? Well, one major difference, which we discussed last time, between Shetland and the Faroe Islands is the Faroese language, which is our first language. Although I know, of course, you have your language, but obviously English is more widely spoken. And according to research by Hoffman and Holm, the language ideologies, ideology of Faroese is one that is termed an ideology of authenticity, which means that our identity is very much tied to the language. It's a minoritized language, and we are not used to hearing people speak our language with different accents. There's a practical aspect of language learning. We have not had high quality language teaching courses, and that's only really just starting to emerge, a sort of slight change there. But also it's very, my informants feel very much that not speaking Faroese almost perfectly is not really tolerated very much so. So it is challenging, because language and authentic Faroese is very much one that speaks the language maybe without an accent and so on. Another key challenge is navigating social and family networks. We are a culture with, it's a small island community, of course, and we have multiple relations, we have different hats on, we meet again and again and again in different contexts. That means that we're very interconnected. But when we see each other again and again, and both in formal and informal settings, it does create a culture of intimacy. And it also leads to interdependency. We need each other in different settings, and power relations can change in different, very fluid, and can change in different settings. So there's also a culture of reciprocity. And of course, if you are an immigrant and people are not familiar with who you are and which networks you belong to, it can be very difficult to get established, and of course on the labour market as well. So attaining skills relevant employment is challenging for immigrants, and especially those that are highly skilled. Sometimes they feel it's a combination of not speaking the language, of the labour market not being tolerant enough about imperfect Faroese, and not really investing in, well, what are they good at and how can I use their skills? But also there is nepotism in Faroese networks. In addition to that, being an island community, the fluidity between formal and informal systems means that governance and politics become personalised and particularistic. So if you're not known, or if you're not familiar with these systems and don't navigate the formal and informal systems, or if you're not recognised as belonging, then that can impact on how you're treated or approached in formal systems, for example, on the labour market. And but I mean, the issue is becoming more and more voiced in politics. Until recently, there's been a climate of a non-policy, or you could say a laissez-faire approach to immigration. We have the Minister of Integration said recently on Faroese media, we're not geared for it, that is the complexity of immigration. And it would also serve the case that we have a general debate where one actually could become familiar with, well, what exactly is the political attitude in the Faroe Islands as far as foreigners are concerned? There simply hasn't been that debate. It's a discourse of silence, which also speaks volumes. So what are the migrant voices in all of this? What are their feelings about their position in Faroese society? Well, they feel when they're not working with in jobs where they're even remotely using their skills, there's a loss of identity. They may come from communities where they are highly valued, and many of them have also tried living in other places, being immigrants elsewhere, and they say, well, we know that it's not easy to be an immigrant, but it just seems to be so much more challenging in the Faroe Islands because there's a lot of sort of fogginess in navigating, because we really don't understand how the systems work, because the formal and the informal just melt together sometimes. And then there's the language promise. There is the ideal or the idea that if you just learn the language, and this is an ideal amongst many immigrants, if you just learn the language, then things will be better. But they find that with time, they're learning the language and they keep on being told, but you can't get this job because you're not quite good enough at Faroese. Or even if they learn the language, find out, well, there's another barrier, and that's Danish, which gets used a lot. So, for example, you might have a job where you use Faroese, but all the manuals that you need to read are in Danish. So they tend to internalize their status as second-class citizens, and are lesser citizens because they're unable to participate and don't have a voice. If they want to complain about something, where do they go? Because the few people that work with integration issues or work with immigrants, they're all connected. So if somebody gets a label of being difficult, then that can even, because these kind of things have a more severe effect on an immigrant than they have on a Faroese person who's already established in Faroese networks. And so there's nowhere they can go and have a voice and be heard, if you like. So their solidarity lies within immigrant groups. That's where they find their solidarity, and that's where they can speak to immigrants about some of the challenges that they face. And sometimes they say, I've been really negative for a few years, but it's because for many of them that this is so challenging. And my data, I mean, there are suggestions that immigrants are more prone to being depressed. I don't have statistics for that, but my informants suggest that they're more vulnerable in terms of depression the first years that they're here. And if that is the case, then that's very serious, of course. But what we sometimes get in the Faroe Islands, we have what I call the hegemonic immigrant, the immigrant that's held up because he or she has learnt the language maybe quickly and got a job which is skills relevant. They've maybe been lucky, maybe they've just got the right background, maybe they're good at learning a language. The context they've come to has helped them learn the language. And they're held up as, look, he or she has managed to learn a language. Isn't she good? Which, of course, can be difficult for other immigrants because, on average, I think it's between 5 to 7 years to learn a new language when you're a grown up, because you cognitively have your cognition of what a language is and its structure gets established in childhood. One of my, and I'm almost finished, one of my informants, a female, a partner of an immigrant who herself has been an immigrant in other countries, said, often immigrants who have learnt the language are held up. Look, he did it. That has a divisive effect amongst immigrants. And often the immigrant who is held up, as the example says, I did not want to be used this way. Everyone feels the pressure that one person is being used against me, although the Faroese may be intending it as encouragement. The discourse in the Faroes is that the Faroe Islands is a good country for everyone, an equal country. We treat our people and immigrants well, but the reality that immigrants experience is completely different. And when you construct a different reality and discourse, then you cannot build your experience on anything that the Faroese know. What Faroese know from discourse is one reality. And when I tell them about my reality, well, then it cannot be hooked onto anything that they have. There is no bridge as such. All that they are asking for is the right to have the same value as others. So what she's saying is even if I explain to Faroese, this is how we are feeling, then it's very difficult for them to understand it, because they're invested in a discourse, or at least believe in a discourse in which, you know, we are a good people, we're good to everyone. So just to conclude, a lot of social change in which the government has had a laissez-faire or a similar stance, which means that government and local institutions have not responded in a timely manner to this change. Of course, it doesn't help that we have a micro island administration, because integration is a complex issue which demands resources. And the universalism in the service provision of the Faroe Islands doesn't seem to fit with diversity and the needs of immigrants. So on a social and community level, immigrants lack recognition and have difficulty participating due to language barriers and the language ideology of authenticity, as well as the closed social networks. And as a result, feel like social class citizens and feel excluded. So I'm just going to stop sharing there. And I'm sorry, I know that's sounds like a negative message, but that's their realities. And I think the Faroe Islands need to wake up to that.
Thank you very much, Erica. I mean, that's understandable situation when people are coming into well, an island community or a rural community anywhere, I suppose, with its own strong cultural heritage and its own language and its own network of families and social connections over generations. And I'm sure you find the same in Shetland. That could be something that could be researched. I don't know if I'd want to research it, but I'm sure there'd be somebody who would like to look into that. I mean, so the thing, you always get asked the question, do you like, you know, you've been here for 20 years, do you like Shetland? How are you enjoying Shetland? Or this sort of thing. So you never really belong. You're always a slightly, you become an islander, but you can never become a Shetlander. So
yeah, that's exactly what the immigrants to the Faroe Islands say. They never get asked about their country. They only want you to report on the Faroe Islands, and it's not really legitimate to say that it's not good. You can say, well, it was a bit difficult at first, but now it's okay. But people withdraw or exclude you if you start criticizing.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Thank you. And John, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, Erica, that was fascinating. I really enjoyed listening to that, and that's an aspect of Faroese society that, although I've visited and continue to visit, I suppose that's an aspect of Faroese society that I've kind of been quite unaware of. I noticed the larger number of immigrants going around. I see that difference. You know, you can hear people speaking, and obviously it can be very visually evident as well. And I wonder, I mean, what the point you made about Shetland, Andrew, I'm sure is true. I mean, I'm a Shetlander. I'm a native, so it's very difficult to understand that. But as you were explaining what you explained as it pertained to the Faroes, I'm sure the same could apply to Shetland. Absolutely. Obviously, the language thing isn't as clear. I mean, people who move into Shetland don't have to learn to speak Shetlandic, because all Shetlanders speak English and will tend to do so with people who've moved in order to be polite. So that's perhaps a difference. But even so, yeah, I'm sure the informal networks, the family networks, and so on, and it's just that thing. My mother, who comes from the island of Walsa and has lived in Burra, the island of Burra, for most of her life. You know, she's, when somebody says, "Where are you from?" she says, "I'm not from Burra, I'm from Walsa." You know, and that's just taking it as an island to island thing. So I'm just rabbiting on, but fascinating, Erica, really interesting, and I'm sure there's lots of parallels to people who've moved to Shetland. I'm sure there is.
Excellent. Right. Well, we've covered a lot of different topics today, a lot of potential routes for research, a lot of well, similar interests clearly being expressed by people in both Shetland and the Faroe Islands. So thank you everyone for your spoken contribution. And but we do have a little bit of time left to address the big question of what do we want to do with this? I mean, we have the opportunity to show each other what we do, and we go, oh yeah, that's relevance for Shetland, and I'm sure on the Faroe side, oh, that's relevant for the Faroe Islands. But we want to. We don't have to come to decisions today, but it would be interesting to know what people think about potential avenues for, say, joint research that we might like to pursue in the future. Was there anything that you thought, oh yeah, well that's something I'd really like to pick up with my colleague on the other side of the water? Some of you already have connections.
Well, a starter for 10, Andrew, I think it's just, there's so many areas, and I think it's just beyond ironic, and it's paradoxical that Shetland is so near to Faroe, and yet we have so little in the way of formal collections. And the Faroes are a community that see themselves at the center of the world, and that's wonderful. I just think that's fantastic. Shetland, lots of people in Shetland, because of the way we're presented on maps and the way we talk about, you know, everything is centralized in Scotland or the UK, and we're very much seen on the periphery. And it's just, it's a cultural cringe. It's absolutely terrible. So we should be looking north. We should be looking more at Faroe and at Norway in terms not only of culture and history and language, but in the very contemporary issues we've touched on today: decarbonisation, fisheries, aquaculture, immigration, knitwear industry, all of those things. There's so much scope for, and it'll do, if the Faroese can put up with us in Shetland, it'll do the Shetlanders the world of good to lift their eyes north instead of this constant preoccupation with it all comes from south.
Yeah, some great points there, John. When I'm teaching modules on Shetland history, I always put Shetland at the centre of the map. I go into Google Maps and put Shetland there. And certainly Scotland is you can still see Scotland, but England is disappearing over the horizon. But just next door are the Faroe Islands and the west coast of Norway. So it's a different perspective. But that's definitely something that we should be exploring. Now, I think Rosie's next, and then Magni, and then Simon. So Rosie.
I just wanted to say this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed today. I can see so many opportunities for work in this area, obviously around the kinds of things that I've talked about. But, you know, like, and I mentioned Erica and Faroes in my presentation, but I'm not sure we have ever been in the same space all presenting at the same time. And so I think that, you know, this has been fantastic, and it would be great to do more of this. And I can see connections with the fishing industry, and I'm interested in young people entering the fishing industry. I'm interested in gender and employment in these different island communities and what that means for pathways. So I can see so many connections. I think one of the things that I'm aware of, and this is very personal, is that although I did work for UHI for 10 years, I'm now with the University of the West of Scotland. And so I would welcome thinking about how we build partnerships between the islands in the North Atlantic region, I guess, which might take in UHI and the University of the Faroes, but also potentially other people and connections with the wider sort of North Atlantic region as well, mostly because I would like to collaborate, but I think there could be other collaborations with other researchers in the North Atlantic region that might have something interesting to contribute to this too.
Excellent point. And of course we have the University of the Arctic Thematic Network of Northern and Arctic Islands, which it does exactly that. And this is sort of an offshoot of that. So, but yes, great idea. And just before I move on to Magni, I should say that the University of the Arctic Thematic Network, Northern and Arctic Islands, is having a workshop in Newfoundland in the in December, starting on the 6th of December, and it will be partly online, but basically we're trying to get people to go to Newfoundland to attend this research strategy workshop and meet particularly Indigenous Canadian researchers. So if you want to know more about that, please let me know. And then, so it was next was Magni. Hello, Magni.
Yeah. Okay. I think I'll start, Pip, by letting you know that I would like to know more about that, about 6th of December. Is there a link for that somewhere, or can I read a bit about it somewhere?
There is some information. I'll email you with some more information. We're just organizing the agenda at the moment. The accommodation will be paid for by Memorial University in Newfoundland, but one would have to find one's own pay for your own flights, as it were, or find some other funding body to pay for that.
Okay.
And it's going to be over, let's see, well, the night of the 6th, and then 7th and 8th of the workshop days, and the 9th is the big mumming parade in St. John's, which is a big intangible cultural heritage event, and people will be encouraged to attend that as well. But the research strategy, we just have the basic one. At the moment, it's just basic, anything to do with Northern and Arctic Islands, but this event will help focus the minds into more detailed research strands. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now for my comments about the research collaboration. I think a lot of the research we do at the moment at my institute, we are collaborating with a lot of different countries. Most of them are not similar to Faroe Islands. I think the closest one is Iceland, and then we are also collaborating with Norway. So northern Norway is a bit similar with both aquaculture and fisheries, but I think the similarity between Faroe Islands and Shetland makes it. I mean, it's obvious that we would have a great advantage of doing some collaboration in the research projects. We will learn a lot from each other. So our institute, as I told you, is mainly in socioeconomics. So we will, which is a broad spectrum. I mean, it's both fisheries and aquaculture. There's also migration and economics. So we have a lot of projects that we are interested in. In Faroe Islands, we also have quite good databases. It's really possible to go to have really good data on individual persons. Of course, they when you publish the data or when you handle the data, you have you have to make sure they are anonymous. But we have really good data on all of the person living in Faroe Islands, which makes it possible to have a good look at of why people are doing things and where people are working and how they migrate between sectors. I'm not sure how good your data are in Shetland or in Scotland, but we have really good data on individual persons that I don't think we use enough. We don't utilize the data enough in Faroe Islands. We only use kind of the big statistics. So I see a lot of research projects.
Excellent. Yep, I can see that too. So one of the things that will come out of this is that we'll keep in contact with each other. But thank you very much, Magni. And next we have Simon. You're on. You're muted.
Sorry, I'm forgetting myself. Fantastic papers there from Rosie and from Erica. Really appreciate that. And not necessarily subjects I would have thought that I would enjoy so much. but really, really lots of potential crossover with areas that I am interested in, actually. And I think there are strong similarities, obviously, between our different areas, the west of Scotland as well as Faroe. But I think the fact that we're peripheral rather than central to the state gives us a sort of permission to make potentially critical comments about each other, which we're more likely to listen to as well, which is interesting. I'm very interested also in John's interest in and Andrew's interest in whether we should have more autonomy. I think that's a really interesting question. I have some reservations about that are to do with whether society becomes too parochial and too inward looking. And I think a sort of a collegiate island approach where you've got a group of people at a similar level with similar problems that can have an outside perspective, but it's not as patronizing as you would have from metropolitan centers, I think is really helpful. So I think for a whole load of reasons, I think we should definitely try to extend these and continue these sessions.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Perhaps, Simon, I could be permitted to come back. I'll be very brief. I'm skipping the queue here. I completely agree with you. To become inward-looking and parochial would be dreadful. I don't believe that is at all a possibility. In fact, I believe the opposite would occur with island autonomy. We become more international. If you're talking about being inward-looking and parochial, look at the United Kingdom.
Yeah, it definitely has a problem with people who don't speak English, for example.
No, I'm talking about Brexit.
Yeah. But it had a problem even before Brexit, whether you supported that or not. I mean, I think Brexit has been a disaster. But I could also point to instances where the island has failed to regulate itself effectively. I mean, I think I raised the issue of blackfish with you the last time we spoke together. I think not that we have control of that in a legal sense, but the fact that so many people knew that was going on and it was not challenged because it's a small place, and you don't challenge your friends.
I think that's where
I think that
into...
sort of thing is a real issue, and I think one of the advantages, I really believe this very strongly, if we could bring together a group of people from across similar islands, they'd have the advantage of sympathy for the situation, but they wouldn't have the social obligations not to speak out. And I think that's potentially quite an interesting situation.
That's a good idea, and that's what we're doing, is it not? So, and also you mentioned the people not speaking out. That brings us to the sort of social dynamics of small island life, which is a really interesting research area. And Erica, you had your hand up, so what would you like to say?
I just wanted to say thank you for all of these interesting talks and being able to discuss it. And I think the discussion that's starting now just shows that we have a lot to talk about. There are obviously this was a really good sort of condensed 10-minute sequence. But I think there's a lot of things would have liked to discuss more with a lot of people, because I just see some really interesting things. And I just would like to add that a few years ago, I was asked by the Robert Hutton Institute in Aberdeen to do a presentation on the Isle of Skye. And I think Rosie presented there, but she was online. So we weren't in the same locale as such, but that has actually since then started a cooperation where we have organized sessions and conferences together, etc., etc., etc. So my point is that by starting dialogues, you start to realize how much you have in common, how much you can learn from each other, where the differences are and what those mean. So I think it's really important that we keep on having this dialogue and see where we can start collaborating more formally with research.
Absolutely. So what we need to do as a takeaway from this is is actually get that starting. What we need to do next. We've got a good idea of what everyone researches, and the last event as well gave us the sort of humanities, history, and culture side of things. So we know there's a huge range of potential topics and disciplines that we could be working together. We have the conversations going, and we know that we like talking to each other. That's an important thing, and like listening to each other as well. So we definitely need to move on to the next stage, but also have some more kind of like public facing events like this, where other people can see what's happening. And Faroes, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much. I don't have much new things to add. I agree very much on that we should continue collaboration. I have really enjoyed participating in these seminars and learned a lot. And I think we can, as I think I mentioned last time, even if we have, we have those tunnels and this autonomy, I think we can learn a lot from Shetland Islands also. And you could also learn, like maybe like some of the things that Ragnar mentioned, also some of the backsides with our development. So I think this has been like a test or an introduction, and I think really we should continue and develop this collaboration, and hopefully in the future arrange also meetings where we can be physically in the same room together. Definitely, I look forward to the next steps. Thank you.
Excellent, and I think that's a good place to call an end to the day. Lots to go away and think about and to muse over. So thank you very much, everyone. If you want more information about Newfoundland, let me know. And we also have St. Magnus conference coming up in April, which is looking at Shetland and the North. So if anyone is interested in either attending or delivering a paper at that, then let me know as well. And with that, enjoy your weekend.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.